what holding the event virtually does is allows for more people to join us, and we're absolutely delighted that getting over 400 people have joined the call today, which for our first conference is really pleasing. So thank you everybody for your time and for choosing to spend the day with us. As I say, I hope you're finding your way around the platform. Fingers crossed that the tech gods are on our side, but if you do have any problems, please use the support chat function, which is either on the menu on the left or on the main splash screen that you joined the platform through, or you can email support@allintheloop.com. And this will then leave the Q&A boxes on the right-hand side free for questions. Our sessions are being recorded and will be available on the platform shortly afterwards, and at a later date on the SGA website, along with any session slide packs that go with them. So we wanted the program today to reflect some of the themes that have characterized the past year, but hopefully in a way that balances, acknowledging the difficulties on the one hand that we've all faced, with on the other hand some optimism as we look to move forward as a sector. We know that people come to these events for some practical takeaways that they can use back at work, in their organizations, in their boards, and with their teams. And I'm sure that today we're going to provide you with plenty of those. What we want is for you to find today stimulating. We've got some top-notch speakers, so I know you're going to hear some interesting arguments. And if those speakers want to say something, perhaps a little bit bold, then that's completely fine. But within reason, please, speakers, if you're listening. Because we want to be challenged, we want you to feel challenged, and we want in return, we want you to challenge us. So feel free to ask tricky questions, and also to tell us if today's the sort of thing that you want, that it's useful to you. Because all along, we've wanted the SGA to be geared towards helping you as a sector, as organisations, and as professionals. So please don't be shy of telling us if we're not managing that, or even if we are, you're allowed to tell us that too. And the final thing that I'd like to say is please get involved. And you can do this in a number of ways. There is the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen. Some of our speakers will answer questions as they go, others at the end of the presentations. But please pop any comments, questions, queries, requests for clarifications, anything like that into there, and the speakers will pick them up. You can also use the hashtag SGAConf21 if you're on social media, and we can try and promote the SGA and get conversations going on those different platforms as well. One of the reasons we wanted to use a platform like this rather than just a Zoom call is to add things like exhibitor stands. So we're really pleased that some of the people who are behind the SGA, some of our partners who help to produce it, are able to sort of have a presence at the conference. And so we've got representatives from the Chartered Governance Institute UK and Ireland, from Sport England, from UK Sport, and from SIMSPA. So please go to the tab marked Our Partners at some point during the day, drop in on them, say hello, and ask them what they're up to, and they'll be pleased to talk to you, I'm sure. And we'd also like you to connect with each other. The attendee tab on your screens shows everybody who's here today. You can see profiles, you can message one another, you can arrange face-to-face calls, and you can search by sort of name, organization, title, roles, things like that. So if you feel comfortable, please fill out your profile, add a photo, and reach out to people, as I'm sure you would if we were holding this in a conference centre somewhere. Because one of the goals of the SGA has always been to make governance in sport a bit more clubbable, a less lonely place. We're all in this together, so let's use today to try and connect with each other, catch up with some existing contacts, and make new ones. So to get things going today, I'm really pleased that Phil Smith, Director of Sport at Sport England, has agreed to say a few words. In addition to his many other responsibilities, Phil is co-chair of the SGA Programme Board and has been so supportive of this project since its inception. So it's an absolute pleasure for me to just hand over to him to have us start us off today.
Thanks, Craig, and good morning, everyone. I suspect everybody's now looking at who else is here because we haven't seen each other, of course, in a long while, and I hope you're all feeling well and looking forward to a good day. So Craig and the team have put together a brilliant day today. They've worked really hard on this. My thanks to all them and my colleagues at Sport England, of course, and all those speaking today for putting this great event together. I am just going to take a few minutes of your time, if you don't mind, to talk about three things. Firstly, what we're doing here with the Sports Governance Academy and why, which is always a good place to start. Secondly, I've got some thoughts on the external environment, what's going on in the outside world, and therefore the context for this work. And thirdly, I want to give you a reflection on where good governance fits in Sport England's new 10-year strategy called Uniting the Movement. So let's start with the SGA and our partnership with the Chartered Governance Institute to set it up. We've created it as part of Sport England's commitment to support the sector to improving its governance. It sits alongside the Code for Sports Governance that you will know of, and this is the practical support side. It aims to provide learning and development, as you've heard from Craig. We're trying to make the topic more understandable, more accessible. I have certainly had to learn about the benefits of good governance. And unfortunately, in my time at Sport England, I've usually learned that by seeing when governance goes wrong and then having to pick up the pieces. So we're trying to make it more understandable and accessible. We're also, including today, trying to connect people across the sector. It's a network opportunity, a shared experience, and we need a few of those right now. It's a safe space for people to share the challenges, to help each other, and access loads of information and education to help you drive your governance forward. So that brings me to who this is for. Well, the focus for us is obviously on organisations that are funded by Sport England and UK Sport, our partners, but we are committed to supporting the sector more widely. It's not just for those people fortunate enough to receive investment from us. So this is a chance for me to welcome those who are not in that gang so far, those from not funded partners. Thank you for joining today. Thanks for joining the community. For the SGA to be successful at all, it's got to be led by our industry. So we do have an advisory group with SIMSPA, our Chartered Institute, as our strategic partner. We've got a group for that purpose, but we please encourage everyone here today to get involved, engage with it, do feedback, get on the website and help us collectively make our industry better. Ultimately, the SGA needs to be the go-to hub for governance support for the sport and physical activity sector. We want to build a longer-term partnership with the Chartered Governance Institute, and I am in discussions with them already to keep the SGA going well past this event and, of course, well past this year into the new strategy. So, my second point, if you don't mind, about the external environment. Obviously, the SGA was established over a year ago in a very different world. And like many organisations, it's had to adapt to what it offers and how to meet the changing needs of our sector, our governance professionals, and of course, how we now have been working. The government's prioritisation of the return of sport and activity has been really welcome. I don't think we should take that for granted. It's been a recognition of how important sport and activity is to the nation's physical and mental health, not least in the last 12 months. But of course, it's been challenging for everyone. So that's why the themes for today's conference are three simple words, but interesting concepts: diversity, resilience, and growth. It's a pretty good summary of where I think we find ourselves in the industry right now. So let's just pause on each of those themes and think about what we mean. Theme one is diversity. Not a new concept to our industry, but the events of the past year, several events in the past year, have highlighted the need for us to improve. We've got to do better, and we've got to focus our intention on more than just warm words. The pandemic has disproportionately affected underrepresented groups. Our new strategy, Uniting the Movement, seeks to go further than we ever have before to tackle those stubborn inequalities. There are reasons that people are prevented from taking part, and we've got to address them. How the boards of our partners reflect the diversity of society and, of course, their membership will be a key part of this, and that is why you're going to hear more from our friends at Perrett Labour shortly. We've already with that partnership, driven 37 appointments to boards in sport so far. We are about to sign the deal to renew the partnership, I'm delighted to say, and you'll hear more from Lucy Simpson of Perrott Labour on that shortly. Theme number 2 is resilience. Over the past 12 months, we frankly had to work hard to just keep our industry alive. Some of it, sadly, will not survive. But we should acknowledge the impact that the pandemic's had on boards, the frequency that those boards have had to meet, the speed of the decisions that they've had to take, the difficulty sometimes of making decisions without much information or, of course, no practice run for what we've all been facing. There's been a lot of personnel change, a lot of stress, a lot of frustration, and including by the fact that many people have not been able to do their very favourite activity or sport, and that's made for a challenging environment for boards and those running the organisations. It's really highlighted, if we didn't know this already, the importance of member and stakeholder engagement. You've got to keep talking and listening to the people in your world. So theme 3 today is growth. We've all had to find new ways of doing things in the last year, and we'll continue to have to do that, no doubt. The SGA has developed an online networking platform, a forum to take the place of in-person networking events, sadly for those of us who like going to a good event, but it's transitioned all of its training to a virtual platform, and you've got everything there you could have possibly had, minus the face-to-face contact, of course. There is some value in virtual board meetings. We've all had to get used to this. And while I suspect many of us would prefer to be in the same room, we do have to pause. We do have to learn from what we've done in the last year. And we need to embrace some of the things we've learned about ourselves, including leadership and governance in the last year. We're not going back to what it was like before. We're not going to go back without at least pausing and reflecting on what's different, what's refreshing. And let's be honest, some of it's quite positive. And we should reflect on that. So finally, that brings me to uniting the movement. It would be remiss for me to not take the opportunity to talk about Sport England's new strategy. Published in January, a 10-year vision, which is ambitious in itself, to transform lives and communities through sport and activity. The immediate focus, as you'd expect, is to recover from the huge pressure brought about by COVID and the pandemic. But also, we are going to get through this. We are identifying the longer term challenges of the next decade. Notably, as I've mentioned, those long-standing inequalities. They've existed for a long time. They've been reinforced by the last year, and we've got to get stuck into it. Uniting the movement seeks to go further than ever before, I think, to make sure not only can we drive up activity levels, but we can tackle those inequalities. Uniting the movement's built around 5 key themes, which we think are the biggest 5 issues, not the only ones, but the biggest 5 issues facing the sport and activity industry in the next decade. Let's see if you agree. The big 5 things. Number 1, recover and reinvent. Helping to recover from the effects of the pandemic and reinventing ourselves as a sustainable network of organisations that provide opportunities for everyone. Hopefully that makes sense. Number 2, connecting communities. How do we focus on sport and activity's role as part of the fabric of the nation, beyond what it can do for individuals? Sport's ability to make our communities better places to live and bring people together. Number 3, positive experiences for children and young people, an unrelenting focus on putting enjoyment at the heart of the experiences of children, not what adults want, but what kids want. Enjoyment, recognising that if kids enjoy sport and activity, it can be the foundation for a long and healthy life. Number 4, connecting with health and well-being, strengthening what we've been doing for the last couple of years, those connections between sport and health and well-being, so more people can feel the benefits of an active life. And number 5, active environments, maximising many of the lessons that the pandemic's brought us, about those places and spaces that make it easier for us to move, to play sport, to travel in our local areas. Those are the 5 big issues we think we have to rise to in the next decade. Now, good governance. Where is that, you might ask? Well, we think good governance is one of the catalysts for change. That is what we're calling it in Uniting the Movement. And I think good governance sits right through all of those 5 big challenges. I don't think we can rise to them without it. We are going to be ambitious. We're going to set high standards, high expectations. That's where the Code for Sport Governance comes in. You'll hear more about that later. But we also realise our role is not just to mark people's homework. We're not just setting standards. We are going to collaborate with you, our partners, as you try and not only reach, but surpass those standards. We set a high bar for ourselves in the knowledge that we can get over it. You'll have seen on the agenda for today that the code is one of our intentions, the new code, part 2. I think it's been one of the great leaps forward. I think when I retire from sport, which might be some while away, it will be one of the proudest achievements I've been involved in. A huge team of people working really hard to put a great code together, and you'll hear more about it today. The revised version is an opportunity to be even better, to stay on top of new challenges, new information. We've got to keep moving. We can't stand still. But alongside the new code, we are putting in place loads of support, lots of tools to help you achieve the standards that it sets and the standards that I know you'll set for yourself. So the SGA as an entity and the event today is a part of that support, and it will continue throughout the year ahead. So that's it from me. Thanks for your attention. This is your day, so please enjoy it. Challenge yourself to network with others. Try and switch off your other distractions if you can and make the most of it. It is an opportunity to step out of that day-to-day work and immerse yourself in something that's really important for the future of our industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I know you're extremely busy and you have other appointments to rush off to, so thank you so much for making some time available for us today, and good luck with everything, and thank you. And so as Phil was saying, please, maybe not right now, but certainly quite soon, feel free to head on over to the SGA website and take a look at some of the resources that we've got there. And as Phil mentioned, we're now just going to run straight into the program. We've got a lot lined up for today, so I won't sort of spend too much time gabbing away. I would rather let you listen to the people that you really hear speak. As Phil said, the Code for Sports Governance has been undergoing a review. The original version, I agree, has had a pretty transformative effect on the sector. And both Sport England and UK Sport are keen to ensure that it remains ahead of the game and keeps serving the sector in helping it to improve its governance. I know many of you took part in the recent consultation exercise, and no doubt many of you are eager to know what the finished product holds in store. So I'm delighted to have Lindsay Tweddle, Head of Corporate Governance at Sport England, and Rob Marini, Head of Governance and International Relations at UK Sport, to give us an update on the consultation process, an idea of what's been learned, and perhaps a little look ahead to see what the road ahead might look like in terms of version 2 of the code. Welcome, Rob and Lindsay.
Thank you, Craig. And I think Craig's going to help us with the slides. So thanks very much for that, Craig. Rob and I are delighted to have the opportunity to speak today. So thank you to the Sports Governance Academy for inviting us. And it's great to see in the chat the range of organisations listening in. So hello to everybody there. We had hoped to speak about the outcomes of the code review today, but we're still currently working with government just to confirm some of the final recommendations and hope to be able to announce those shortly. So sorry we can't sort of speak in detail about the outcomes today, but we thought what we would cover is, and hopefully, I'm not sure if you can see the slides yet, but but hopefully you can. What we thought we would cover is, firstly, I'll sort of give a bit of background about the code. Thank you, Craig. Give a bit of background about the code for those who are less familiar with it, including a bit about the implementation of it the first time round and the impact it's had. And then Rob's going to give some reflections on the impact and what our experience has shown us over the last few years. I'll talk a bit about the approach we've taken to the review and the scope. Next slide, please, Craig. I'll talk a bit about the approach we've taken to the review and the scope, and then Rob will sort of talk a bit about what we've learnt based on the consultation and views we gathered as part of that. And then Rob will move on to what's come next and the direction of travel. So just to give you a bit of an outline of the sorts of things we're going to cover today. Then at the end, we're hoping to have some time for questions. And if we see some questions coming up in the chat at the side and we spot something along the way, we'll try and answer those as well. So next slide, please, Craig. Thank you. So the code the genesis of the code was the government sports strategy Sporting Future they published back in December 2015, where they set an action for Sport England and UK sport to essentially develop a code for sports governance. And we worked on that for the best part of sort of 9 months. It was quite a short timeline to produce it, but we launched that with an event for partners in October 2016, and then it went live essentially for investments from the investment period from April 2017. And in the sports strategy, the government essentially set an ambition for the code to set a gold standard in governance. So against a backdrop at the time of some international scandals in sport governance, IAAF and FIFA, they wanted England and the UK bodies to be leading the way in terms of sports governance. And it wasn't that our sector was in a particularly poor position, but they wanted us to be world leading. So there's that ambition for setting the high standard from the start. And it's a mandatory code. So essentially it's investment conditions. So any bodies seeking funding from Sport England or UK sport must comply with the code. So it provides quite a firm lever in that sense for change, and at the time it did. And there's a range of partners that we both invest in, and Sport England in particular has such a cross-section of partners it works with. It was really important for the code, given that it was a mandatory condition, to be proportionate and to be applied in all those different settings. So for that reason, it's got 3 tiers, and that allows different tiers to be applied at different levels of investment, or depending on the nature of the relationship with the partner, the body that we're investing in. So tier 1 currently, in the sort of current code, has 7 minimum governance standards, and tier 3, which is the highest level of the code, has 58, which sounds a lot, but it's codifying a lot of things that are standard normal practice that organisations are already doing. And so over the last 4 years, I think it says 3,000 there, and on a recent check, I think it's probably just over 4,000 organisations have now been assessed against the code as compliant with it, or have put in actions in place to become compliant. Now, a lot of those are at the lower level, the tier 1 range of the code. That's where you get into the thousands, because Sport England's making a lot of investments at that level. But you can see the impact that's having across the sector. But there are still 300 partners at the top 2 tiers of the code being assessed and working towards compliance with the code. And that's just under 20% of those are national governing bodies of sport. So there's often a perception the code only relates to national governing bodies, but it's had a much broader impact than that. So now just under 20% are NGBs, about 16% are active partnerships, so local sport partnerships, and the rest are strategic partners, such as some of which I'm sure will be listening in today, such as Women in Sports, the Youth Sport Trust, Street Games, Chance to Shine, Sporting Equals, Simpsfer, that Phil spoke about, and UK Coaching. Now, I won't name check everybody, but I'm sure there'll be a few here today. But you can see that the scope that the code's had and the impact that it's had. And and those partners and the people we work with in the sector have engaged so positively with it. There were challenges, of course, at the start. It was a new code, it's a mandatory investment, it's involved some significant changes, but partners in the sector have engaged so positively with it, and we're really grateful for that. Next slide, please, Craig. So just to give you a bit of information about, what impact has the code had when it's been implemented over the last 4 years, and this by no means covers everything. This just gives a bit of a flavour and some examples of some of the changes and some of the support areas we've worked in. So there's been reforms to board membership, and that includes things like increased independence on boards and greater diversity around the board table. There's also been improved transparency, so more information published about how organisations run, the decisions they make, the documents that govern them. So often you'll look on websites now and you'll be able to access, the documents, their articles of association or their strategy frameworks. And also organisations, many more are publishing minutes or key outcomes of board discussions. So it's more transparent for those people, for members of the organisation, for those people involved in that organisation, playing that sport or doing that physical activity. And then the introduction of maximum term limits has also meant there's been a renewal, a refresh of ideas around that board table, as well as creating more opportunities, more vacancies, more opportunities for people to get involved in sports governance. Now, underpinning that was a huge amount of work from bodies in the sector who are funded from UK Sport and Sport England to make those changes, working really hard with their partners, with their members, to agree those and drive those through to strengthen governance within their organisations. So it absolutely is an effort across the sector. So part of that, alongside that sort of the changes that organisations have needed to implement, we've tried to put in place some support initiatives to help organisations. And I should say there's been a shift as well. I think at the start, when the code was first introduced, it was naturally quite a compliance heavy process. It felt like that because there was a big period of assessment, and organisations had to make some significant changes at the time. But all through that, despite the sort of feeling of being compliance heavy, we've been keen to make sure that alongside that we are supporting organisations and working with them to make those changes. And here's just an example of a few of the initiatives that have been put in place. So the Sports Governance Academy, of course, that Phil spoke in a bit more detail about. And he also mentioned the Parrot-Laver partnership, which has developed a network of senior experienced candidates from a range of backgrounds to help develop greater board diversity in the sector. We've had knowledge exchanges, so facilitated sessions with partners on areas such as the role of the senior independent director. Over the last year, we've put in place some specific COVID support. So we have an assurance partner in BDO that would normally conduct assurance reviews. We changed for the last year the support they provided, and they developed a web hub and a helpline for partners to provide support on COVID specific issues around financial management or anything related to how organisations were running. And alongside that, from a COVID point of view, we also opened up some access to the legal advice through the legal panel framework and have funded that for some partners. And then there are specific project support, so individual awards to organisations for governance improvement projects, and that's covered a variety of different things such as board evaluations, strategic reviews, regional governance reviews, so reviews of governance within regions, perhaps within a governing body, HR support and financial advice. So a huge amount of different support initiatives, and that's absolutely one of the areas that we'll be developing further over the next year as we come to announce the outcomes of the code review. So I'll hand over to Rob, and I think it would be next slide, please, Craig. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks to the SGA for inviting us to speak. It's really great to be speaking to so many of you this morning. So briefly, just an opportunity to share some reflections, I guess, from our perspective, both from UK Sport and Sport England's effectively governance teams that have really done a lot of the work in terms of rolling out the code and working with you. I mean, Lindsay alluded to this before, sort of, there is no question that when the code came out, it really felt as a top-down instrument being mandated and effectively imposed on the sector for all the reasons that sort of Lindsay outlined before in terms of strategic rationale for the code to be in place in the first place. But I think sort of, fairly quickly, there's been really strong engagement and collaboration from yourselves and from many of our funded partners. And actually sort of, there was a risk that the code could be seen as a tick box exercise, as something to comply with. And of course, sort of, the very nature of it, that sort of, an element of that undoubtedly sort of was there and is still there. But I think sort of the way the sector responded and funded partners responded enabled a much more, a much deeper and meaningful conversation with partners in terms of how the code could assist effectively sort of, the governance of the organisation. And I think what we've seen over time as well, that whilst this was kind of rolled out onto funded partners, as new partners came on board, new organisations that have been seeking UK Sport and Sport England investment, really our own engagement with them has also evolved and changed. Perhaps one of around really being able to explain sort of, the code and actually making sure that sort of, it's applicable to the needs of the organisation, and organisations see sort of, how it can assist. So it's something that I think we've witnessed a bit of an evolution in terms of how the code is then applied and used by partners. Inevitably, I mean, it's been almost it's been 4 years that it's been in place. We've had feedback from you and from the range of other partners in terms of what's worked, what's not worked. The code has been new to everyone, including ourselves. And actually, the areas where more support is really required, and that's something that we can touch on later, because I think that's something that we picked up as part of the review. But I think the key point here that we absolutely want that feedback to continue, because it's critical in order to be able to work together and address some of the issues and challenges that I think Phil outlined at the start. It is a standard framework. It is divided into these 3 tiers. And some of the challenges sometimes is really to be able to ensure that sort of the framework applies consistently and across the board, even though we've got these kind of different chunks of organizations belonging to different tiers. But ultimately, we have to recognize that no one size fits all, and therefore we've had to be pragmatic and flexible in the way we've applied the code. But also critically, we've got to be consistent. And I think that's where that tier 2 and tier 3, where we've got, like Lindsay said, about 300 organizations in those tiers, we've been able to apply sort of particularly in the tier 2 area, sort of a mix of measures to ensure that it responded to organizations in terms of their size and the size of the investment and ultimately what was required of them. Inevitably, sort of, we've been working very closely together as sports councils, and I would argue that perhaps that this is an area in which the 2 sports councils, UK Sport and Sport England, have been working probably the closest on across sort of, the different areas of work that we do engage in. Inevitably, sort of, there's always ways in which we can sort of, look at working even better together, not just between ourselves, but also with yourselves. And again, that's been a running thread in terms of the review of the code as we started to kind of look at any changes that we might want to put in place. And Lindsay already touched on this in terms of the tangible impact on structures, particularly in terms of decision making. Other areas that we've seen, quite interestingly, is I think the code has allowed sort of, organizations to really get on with policies and procedures that perhaps were there in the making for some time, but actually sort of it's kind of encouraged organizations to get them done in some respects and actually see the benefit of really getting those finalized. And we've seen those playing their part in terms of really creating organizations that do have those policies and procedures in place and are able to kind of ensure that level of accountability and transparency. and ultimately, as I said, sort of, the level of support that the partners have requested from us is something that I think we've also seen a lot of the fruits of. Ultimately, is an instrument of good governance. It is a set of requirements, but governance is obviously goes beyond that. Governance is about obviously the way we make decisions, the culture around boards, the cultures within the organisation, and how decisions are made. And therefore, it's really important that those factors are also weaved into as we started to review the impact and where we want to go next with the code. Next slide, Craig, please. Perhaps just to take a bit of a left turn here, because this is one of the areas that I also oversee. Sort of is sort of UK sport investment in international relations. We fund a number of NGBs that sort of effectively then are active in international sport, particularly within their international federations, their well-governing bodies of which they're members, to ensure that the UK has got a stronger, respected and influential voice in shaping decisions and shaping also the governance of international sport. Now, Lindsay touched on this earlier. Sort of, the code came in sort of at a time when there were some big issues in international sport. All of you will remember sort of, the scandals impacting FIFA. And there was a desire from government to sort of ensure that the UK and England sort of were seen as sort of showcasing really high standards of governance, and that could be also conveyed internationally. Since producing the code and rolling out the code, I mean, especially those first few years, we've had a number of countries expressing a lot of interest in the very nature of the code, and sort of and actually the sort of the product itself in terms of what it consists of and the content of it. We've had countries such as Poland and Japan and Australia that have emulated the code since. They've come up with their own codes, obviously quite different in some respects. For example, Japan looks at sport integrity more broadly. Poland has a similar sort of framework as ours, but it's been quite interesting also from countries such as New Zealand, France and Italy and Germany and Canada and so on, that really have taken an interest in how we've devised the code and the very principle of safeguarding public investment and actually putting in place this kind of these mandatory measures. But it's also caused a bit of a stir. I think in relation to the principle of autonomy of sport, that clearly sports are very attached to, and it's really important to this principle of actually government and funding councils effectively sort of mandating requirements onto them. And the way we've explained to them is that effectively sort of we absolutely respect the principle of autonomy of sport. That's integral to sport, but ultimately we have a responsibility for safeguarding public investment, and therefore if organizations want to access that funding, it seems right and proper that these standards are in place. And the other thing is really about the sort of the introduction of a mandatory requirement around independence, at least 25% for those tier 3 organisations, almost running against sort of the principle of democracy, and that's been quite interesting to witness. Sort of amongst perhaps I'd argue some of the supposedly some of the more progressive nations, for example, sort of Scandinavian countries, really objecting to the point of actually sort of sport is for sport, and therefore sort of when you look at the skills and when you look at the people that sort of populate the boards and the decision-making bodies of sport, it should come from within sport rather than seeking sort of skills and independence and people from the outside. Because ultimately having people that don't understand sport, and that's actually been quite an interesting dialogue and dichotomy that we've had to explain. And actually sort of this is really recognizing that sort of the skills that are required in any business, and that includes sport, and sport ultimately is a business, that sort of and sort of really making sure that the governing bodies have that balance of skills and individuals from within and also from the outside. As I said, sort of NGBs are quite active in shaping international sports governance. We need to be really careful and really sensitive that this is not about the UK sort of showing the rest of the world how governance is done. It's absolutely not the case, and in fact, it's not about sort of promoting the code as such, but actually sort of, what we've seen is NGBs drawing on sort of, some of the provisions in the code to kind of then try and generate reform, particularly around term limits in international sports bodies. And you'd be surprised, quite a number of them had none. So you had presidents and people on those decision-making bodies over more than 3 decades. The final thing I would say here is sort of, that we've been able to establish an international partnership against corruption in sport, which really looks at promoting sort of a number of measures to ensure that the risks of corruption are reduced in global sport. And that is a partnership that involves the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, the International Paralympic Committee, and several international federations, of which many of you are members, but also other governments as well. And there is absolutely no question that the code has been seen as an instrument, as a framework to really refer to, not just in terms of the provisions, but I think also the way it's outlined with sort of, with the requirements and the commentaries and the narrative that wraps around sort of, effectively governance in sport in England and across UK bodies. So, and it's interesting from an international perspective, is looking at it through the lens of corruption. We don't quite have the sort of, we're not looking, it's not the same lens we're doing it here in the UK, but nonetheless, it is actually the sort of, the role that good governance has in tackling sort of, some of the issues that we certainly find in international sport. Pass on back to Lindsay. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So that's given you, I guess, sort of a background to the code as it existed, the initial code that was developed, and the implementation of that and some of the impact that it's had. So moving on to the review of the code 4 years on, I guess we've just included a couple of quotes here to sort of indicate or illustrate how the review came about. We already had been thinking about doing the review, but probably had it penned in for this year rather than last year, I'd say. But and next slide, please, Craig. There's a quote there from the minister sort of initiating the review, and then this quote sort of outlines sort of Sport England and UK sport views as we initiated the review itself. So as I said, we've been looking at doing the review of the code anyway 4 years on, but accelerated that against a backdrop of Black Lives Matter and a particular focus on diversity and inclusion. It seemed right to accelerate that review process and commence it last year rather than this year. And you can see here in the quotes there the importance of diversity and inclusion in terms of the review. Next slide, please, Craig. So this, I'll just talk a little bit about the scope of the review and the approach we've taken. So as I've mentioned and just sort of introduced there, we've taken a particular focus on diversity and inclusion with the review, but we have taken the opportunity as well to do a general review of all aspects of the code. So whilst it's had that targeted focus, that hasn't been the only element of it. Having said that, with looking at diversity and inclusion, that hasn't just meant we've looked at those specific diversity requirements in the code. We've taken that lens across everything in the code. So the work stream that was looking at diversity and inclusion has looked not only at the sort of 3 specific requirements that currently exist in the code around that, they've looked at every single requirement and every aspect of the code. And of course, it's made sense in doing the review to review best practice developments over the last 4 years to make sure that the revised code is current. Well, not only current, but future-proofed as well. So we've looked ahead to what else is on the horizon, what else is being talked about in the world of governance. And then we've also thought about what other new areas might be included in the code. So there's always a bucket list of things that get put together in terms of things people, or not just us, but other people want to put in the code. Because it's been quite an effective lever for change in a number of areas, and it's a mandatory condition of investment, it's quite useful for some people thinking, oh, if we put that in the code, we can get that done. So there's always been a bucket list building up. We've taken a really hard look at at this time with the review to consider on that sort of shopping list of things, is the code the right tool for those things, or are there other better mechanisms in place to deliver those? So you can see quite a rounded review, but with that particular focus on diversity and inclusion elements. So given that scope and the terms of reference, just a bit about our approach to the project itself. You won't be surprised that I've sort of noted there, or we've noted, diverse and inclusive project management was really important to us. So we didn't just want to talk about diversity and inclusion in terms of the code and delivery. We wanted to make sure that that was embedded throughout the project. And there's a number of ways we've tried to do that. So colleagues, we haven't just sort of formed a project with colleagues from the governance teams in both organisations. We've looked across both organisations and drawn on experience and expertise and knowledge and skills, and that includes our internal staff networks who are looking at areas such as ethnic diversity, disability, and really drawn on their skills. And then as part of that, we also felt it was important to bring some external objective perspective into the project. So our project board had 3 independent members on it, and a couple of them, I think, at least are here today. So Pippa Britton, who amongst other things is Vice Chair of Sport Wales, and very experienced in the area of governance. We had Nigel Boatswain, who was Director at Apple and is on the Dame Kelly Holmes Trust and was part of the Perrott Labour Partnership. And then Craig, who's been speaking already, who was able to bring his experience from the Chartered Governance Institute. And we were incredibly lucky to have, feel really fortunate to have those 3 independent members on the project board who brought such valuable contributions to the project. And I think really the whole project recognised the importance of their input. And then we also, it was really important for us also to make sure that the work that we developed was evidence-based, and there are a number of ways in which that was achieved. So I'm sure a number of you on this call will have contributed as board members to the diversity audit. So that's an audit looking at the composition of boards across the sector and trying to get a sense of how diverse they are. That's building on previous audits that have, call them audits if you like, but surveys that have taken place of that women in boards have conducted, looking at, the gender diversity on boards, ethnic diversity and disability as well. So we wanted to make sure that we had the latest position on that. And then we've also done other work such as comparative analysis with other sectors. And then, of course, we wanted to hear the views from the sector, and undertook a consultation which was managed independently. And that took the form of an online survey and 10 focus groups. And thank you so much to those of you who contributed to that. Rob will give a flavour of some of the things we've learned coming out of the consultation. And then as a joint project, it's been really important for us to act as one team, and it's really felt like that at all levels of the project. So not just within the project team itself, but our CEOs are very aligned on this. Every level across both organisations has worked really closely on the code, and you'll hopefully see that Rob and I are presenting together today, hopefully seamlessly. But it's really felt like a one team effort, and we're keen to make sure that continues, as we have tried to ensure over the last 4 years. And lastly, important to seek legal advice where it's been needed to test and check any elements or changes we are proposing that might have had a legal angle. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how the review was approached and what it looked at. And Rob will tell you a bit more now about what we learned through the review process. Thanks, Rob. Next slide, please, Craig. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. So, you heard Lindsay talking about sort of the consultation. We've had more than 200 responses to this, and from the online survey, as well as sort of focus groups that took a deeper dive in some of the kind of areas that Lindsay outlined that sort of were part of the scope of the review. And we took that opportunity to kind of test the impact of the code. And actually, we've been really heartened by by responses saying that the vast majority of organisations have indicated that the code has been a really effective and helpful tool for their organisations, and that has had a real impact. So that's obviously been a real positive. At the same time, and again, it's just looking back at what we were mentioning before, particularly those first 6 to 12 months in terms of when the code was rolled out. There is no question that some organisations felt the pain and actually experienced real resistance from within and real challenge, particularly where they had to reform their structures, their decision making structures. Hopefully, now the dust has settled, and actually, what we are seeing is more of a shift around supporting and working with partners to really ensure that those changes are being embedded, and we are supporting you throughout. The two main areas of impact, interestingly, have been the tightening of the organisation's governance overall. I mentioned earlier one of the things that as teams we witness is policies and procedures that organisations really just got on with in terms of making sure they were finalised, but also actually how governance is not something that was just affecting the board, but actually how that's cascaded across the organisation and indeed the member bodies of a particular sport. But Lindsay has already outlined the equality and diversity on the board. So the fact that we introduced a gender target of at least 30% of either gender on boards has really obviously has changed the makeup on the boards, but I think more fundamentally, the diversity of thought on the boards and actually the quality of the discussions that have taken place on the boards. That's certainly something that we've been hearing loud and clear through the survey and indeed through our own experience of working with partners. As I said before, the changes in many cases have not just been limited to the boards, but actually started filtering down into the organisation's culture. Particularly around areas of accountability and transparency, and indeed also on diversity. But there are areas inevitably of improvement. And the code is seen as quite accessible in terms of language, but I think there are areas where it could be simplified, particularly for those tier 1 organisations that might be new to this and to governance more broadly. So are there is to making sure that we use much more plain English and really explain concepts in a simpler way. But also, actually, the code at the moment is it's a PDF document and involves quite information across all of the 3 tiers. Is there an opportunity for developing interactive guidances and examples from the sector that individual organisations could draw on and actually ensure that they can access the information that is really more readily available and relevant to them. And also the principle of proportionality. Ultimately, the code is, as you've heard, is structured in line, tiers of investment. But there is a question that you could be receiving very high amounts and therefore be in the tier 3 category, but be quite a small organisation, and therefore internal capacity for handling the different requirements of the code could be quite limited, and therefore just I suppose making clear to both UK Sport and Sport England some of the pressures that sometimes this organisations experience in terms of implementing the code as well. Next slide, Craig. Lindsay touched on this already. ED&I is was the substantive focus, has been the substantive focus of the review. and is an area that I sort of through the survey we've also been encouraged that actually many organisations felt that this is something that they welcome as part of the review, but alongside that also making very clear that any changes or any additional sort of measures around ED&I should really be strongly supported by UK Sport and Sport England. Actually, organisations in the sector as a whole really looking for guidance and for sort of both central support, i.e. from within, from our own organisations, as well as specialist support, particularly in the area of recruitment, where sort of many organisations struggle to look outside of the pool that is really known to them for board members, and indeed sort of many recruit from their membership bodies, apart from obviously sort of independent non-executive directors, and for that sort of I mean you've had references to the Parrot Labour project. I won't go into detail because there's a session on that later on, but that's something that we've certainly sort of heard many organisations welcoming that sort of type of support and increased support in that area. Next slide, Craig, please. So other areas, sort of, that came from the survey and from the focus groups, really sort of, suggestions of including areas such as environmental sustainability, and this is really sort of looking at sort of and also what's happening sort of in the medium to long term, and what is it that and other organizations to which the code applies really should be thinking about more proactively about safeguarding, and perhaps that won't come too much as a surprise given the whole we've all been facing. And also, as I said, sort of the cascading from board to other parts of the organisation is something that we've been hearing quite loud and clear. I think a very strong point has been made around board culture, that this is sort of recognising the importance of the fundamental, paramount importance of actually sort of the culture that exists within the board, and actually the role of the chair and obviously all other board directors in ensuring that a positive, inclusive, and constructive culture is built around the table, and again that's from the top of your across the board, and that's something that we've taken quite in the last couple of years and initiated a project. We put it on hold in view of COVID, but actually something that's not least through the feedback is something that we're actively interested to pick up again and really engage with you on as we go forward and roll out the code. And finally, sort of, the importance of transparency, something that absolutely sort of, the feedback sort of, revealed. This is something that organizations are really, and actually sort of, continuing to share information in the public domain. The final point is we are recognise that we are in a very privileged position at UK Sport and Sport England, because in many ways we've got this kind of helicopter view in terms of what's happening across nations, and actually a message specific from across the sector or specific groups of organisations, and drawing examples of best practice or where things even have gone wrong, so that actually sort of funded partners can learn from that. And I think again this is something the SGA sort of will already assist on and will be able to assist on in the future, I have no doubt. I think the final couple of slides you'll be pleased to know. Next slide, please, Craig. It's really sort of, so what next? And we have completed the review, as Lindsay said. We're just talking to government about some of those recommendations, but we expect sort of to announce shortly sort of the changes in the code. And as I said, sort of you won't be surprised, given what we've heard from funded partners, is that we are sort of really very carefully looking at the nature and you heard Phil mention about Sport England strategy and sort of good governance being one of the catalysts in that strategy. UK Sport is due to announce our own strategy sort of in the coming few weeks to partners and to the media. So you'll find out, you'll hear more about that soon. But I think perhaps one thing that I wanted to mention is that from our perspective, the work on governance remains critical, but also as part of a wider lens that we're going to be applying on organizations in terms of their wider corporate health, which includes governance, but also expands in other areas of finance and strategy and leadership and connectivity across the system. So this is something that we're already working with our own funding partners, and something that we'll be expanding on into over the course of the next few years. I think one thread that sort of is going to run through not only sort of the revised code, but actually the way we can see the next steps in governance is a phrase that Lindsay has used, and I really loved, in terms of shifting from mandated governance to actually governance that is owned by the sector. And I think something, again, it just repositions the way not only the code, but also UK Sport England found themselves in relation to the code, and actually this not being a top-down instrument that obviously will be there to safeguard sort of public investment, but we are there to kind of work with you to kind of implement and see how we can take governance to the next level. But also recognise, as Phil's mentioned earlier, that we are in a very disrupted, very new, very difficult, very challenging environment, and therefore we also need to recognise that actually that the sort of the way that the code is presented and sort of what it's there for needs to recognise that the challenges of the sector, and therefore those three elements of diversity, growth and resilience, I think is something that speaks to the way we want to approach our governance work going forward. The final slide is just a couple of images, and I think it just tries to depict and remind ourselves what this is all for. And it is about sort of sport and physical activity. And actually was Pippa Britton that was on our project board. Sort of the way she described the governance is that thread, right, that brings that little child sort of on that boat and runs through sort of the volunteers and the coaches and the workforce and the leaders, and then all the way up to board, and indeed the success that often we enjoy in high performance sport is that thread that brings it and links it all together. And I think sort of it's really important and great to be looking at governance through that lens, rather than seeing it as fairly dry sort of kind of thing that sort of organizations need to comply with and tick that box. It's part of sort of the everyday fabric of what we love most. I think that's it. So I hope that was useful, and look forward to talking and questions next.
Rob, as you were talking there, I could see I was trying to pick up some questions in the side. So I'll maybe sort of try and scroll back to the first one I could see from Mark Lucas, Director of Strategy and Performance at Work. So talked about, can you explain a little more with I think it means what the 30% target is. So just to explain, that's in the current code, and that's one of the requirements where we ask organisations to set a target for at least 30% gender representation on their boards. So making sure there are at least 30% of men and women at the time when we were doing the code. That's how it was sort of couched, because some organisations were their boards were predominantly male, and we do have some that were predominantly female. So it was making sure that the organisations set a target themselves of at least 30% representation. Esther Jones, Diversity and Inclusion Manager at UK Coaching, asked, are the review findings going to be published? So we will publish the outcome of the review. We haven't sort of intended to publish the consultation findings, not for any reason. If we find that that's useful, we could review that, but more that was a piece of information that informed, one piece of information that formed the review, but some of the findings from the consultation will form part of the announcement about the outcome of the review. So we'll hopefully pick out the salient points. Rob, I'll carry on going, but I'm conscious I'm answering them. So if there's any that you want to pick up as you go along. So Ruth has asked, are you ensuring, for Ruth Holdaway, I think from Women's Sport, are you ensuring all organisations meet the gender target? I.e., are you now refusing to fund organisations that don't achieve the target? Organisations have had a long time to achieve this. So yeah, and it's a question that comes up, given that it's a mandatory code. We often get asked about penalties and what's the penalty of not meeting the code, either in this area or any other area. Ultimately, there is as a mandatory condition of funding, there is a sanction of funding if we want to, if we find that that's needed, but that's absolutely not our starting point. So we want to drive change. We want to work with organisations to achieve those changes. So our starting point would be to have a conversation with partner to understand what they're finding difficult in that area, why that isn't happening. And I think what we're really looking for is meaningful, tangible progress. And a willingness to do that. I think conversations get harder where there's not that willingness and drive to make those changes. Rob, this might be one given the UK sport remit. What Laddie from Leisure and Physical Activity Development Manager at Hackney Council has asked what the buy-in is from the other home countries outside of England to the code.
Yeah, great question. We are in regular dialogue with our counterparts in the other home country sports councils, and so there's been open sharing about the code, and also hearing and learning from the frameworks that they've got in place. There's no, it isn't buying as such, but I think it's more about actually really learning and understanding the different frameworks that are in place. Where we are seeing, and I think this is running both within UK Sports certainly, and I'm sure at Sport England as well, a real desire to share more with our counterparts across the sports councils, not just in governance terms, but also actually more broadly in terms of the sporting system as a whole, and how we work more collaboratively, across the board to help organisations, really address some of the challenges, some of which might be in governance and in other areas as well, particularly off the back of obviously the year that we've had. So I expect, if anything, this area to increase going forward. So yeah.
Thanks, Rob. I see a couple of questions there. So from Lucy McClements at British Handball and Beatrice McGlenn at the Croquet Association asking, I think about support there and currently unfunded organisations. So one of the things I would like to say is that Phil mentioned before our strategy Uniting the Movement and the good governance catalyst within that. And one of the focus areas we have is to focus governance support on organisations. It's a passion of mine to focus some of our support on organisations we don't currently fund, because traditionally, because of the connections we have, our support and the support offerings have been directed really at funded bodies. But I'm really keen that we develop our support programme much broader than that. So we'll be looking particularly to try and make sure there's access for organisations that aren't currently funded through the traditional route from UK Sport or Sport England. So hopefully we'll be developing plans over the next year in that area. Simon at Living Sport. Go on, Rob. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I think I'm a little bit ahead in terms of some of the questions that I can see as well.
So Simon at Living Sport has asked said many of us are charities and companies. How does the code relate to their guidance? Has there been a check review against their standards to see if there are pulls in different directions? And is there, or should there be primacy of any one of these? So yeah, absolutely. There are a number of different codes out there, and Sport England in particular has connections with so many different types of bodies. So we have quite a bit of experience over the last 4 years of funding bodies that are many charities or to whom different codes apply. And I think that the code has proved itself adaptable in that respect, so that there shouldn't be anything contradictory in there, and we're able to adapt and interpret the requirements in a way where if you're already doing things, then we would just take that as part of the assessment. And the code isn't law either, I should say that. So it's a funding condition, but of course, if there are aspects of law, either through charity or company law, that you need to meet, then that would absolutely take precedence. But the code, as I said, shouldn't cut across those in any way. It should be able to align with those, as we've sort of tested it quite thoroughly over the last 4 years.
Sorry, Lindsay, just on Simon's
Yeah.
point there, it's probably worth saying that certainly the Charity Governance Code does state quite explicitly that it recognises that some organisations cross sort of sectoral boundaries, and if there's a code in a particular sector that you can or should adhere to, then do that. And I think it mentions by name this code that if you're a sporting charity, then perhaps you might want to sort of give primacy, as Simon phrases it, to the sports code. So it recognises that there's not the potential for conflict, but there's the potential for overlap in terms of sort of regulatory oversight, for want of a better word. So I think it would suggest that if you're a sport, use the sports one.
Thanks, Craig. Sorry, go on, Rob, did you pick up some questions there?
Yeah, there's a question there around from Pamela Woodman from the LTA, sort of in terms of anticipated timescales for setting out the details of the changes and the publication of the new code. Hopefully soon. We do sort of anticipate this to be able to announce the changes hopefully in May. As I said, we're just talking to government counterparts to make sure that they are briefed and they're aware of the recommended changes. And in terms of and that will sort of, what we expect in the announcement is to share what those changes are and what the requirements are. But in terms of the publication of the new code itself, that will take probably a couple of months for us to produce the revised version of the code itself. What we focused on is around actually the changes to the requirements and the commentary that currently are there. So as I said, we hope to put an announcement out shortly and then publish the code in a couple of months' time. And then in terms of organisations then having to comply with any new requirements, set out timescales that absolutely takes into account what the changes are and allow for that time to take place. Apologies if it sounds a little bit woolly, but I think you'll appreciate we're just waiting to that final checking internally before we provide all the detail. But the detail will be available when we're ready to announce.
Craig, I'm conscious of time. There are a few more questions there.
I think there are a couple of questions. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to them in this session. Perhaps it's something that we can pick up through other channels. But Sport England and UK Sport want the code to help organisations, and that I've really come to understand that that's the sort of driving motivation behind the code. So it's really exciting to see the consultation take place, and it will be really exciting to see exactly what those changes are in the next month or so. So Rob and Lindsay, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for that update. It's been really interesting, and I'm sure the people on the call will have been really pleased to see how far we've come down the line in terms of this sort of evolution of the code, and we'll all look forward to seeing the finished product. So thank you both very much.
Thank you, Craig. And if there is a way we can pick up any of the other questions, either put them on the SGA forum or whatever, but very happy to do that. So not to lose them. Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Rob. Thank you both for your time. And as Lindsay and Rob were just saying, the issue of diversity has been a central one in terms of the code and in terms of dialogue more generally for the past year or so. And I think so much progress has been made in the sector over recent years, but I don't think anyone would argue that there isn't still a job of work ahead in order to ensure fair and equal or equitable representation in the leadership of organisations, and in terms of harnessing the benefits that diversity brings. And in his message earlier, Phil mentioned the brilliant work that Parrot Labour have been doing to create a pool of board-ready candidates for the sector with the aim of improving the diversity in the leadership of sports organisations. And it's fantastic to hear that that relationship has been renewed. And joining us next are Lucy Simpson and Shivani Smith from Perrott Labour, who are going to talk about the importance of diversity on boards, some of the challenges that the sector faces and has faced, and also to tell us about that work with Sport England and others that they've been doing, and perhaps also how some of you can get involved in that. So I think we should have them joining us now-ish.
I think we're here. If others can
appearing on my screen,
see us.
hopefully they'll be here in a second. But just to re-emphasize, if those people who had questions that aren't able to be answered in the sessions, if they can either contact speakers directly, or they can use the huddle, the forum on the SGA website, or they can try and contact people through. We've got you'll be able to go over to the exhibitor stands in the main lobby or on the left of your screen, and that way you can get in touch with UK Sport and Sport England. They've both got a number of representatives there who you can have immediate video chats with. Or
Hello. Just to check, can everyone hear us before we start?
I do seem to have company, which is excellent because I was flying around filling dead air. So Lucy, Shivani, thank you for joining us. And I think we've already eaten into a little bit of your time, so I'll get out of your way and I'll let you crack on with your presentation. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. So first of all, we just wanted to say a massive thank you for having us. It's great to see all the names listed today and know that you're here virtually somewhere. And I think, I guess, as was just mentioned, the overall message that we want to deliver today is one of celebration, the progress that we've seen across the sector. We want to share some musings on the challenges and best practice, and just to urge everyone not to take their foot off the pedal when it comes to delivering on diversity. Great progress has been made, but there's still a lot to be done, and we're very much here to help through our partnership with Sport England and UK Sport where we can. So our reader format today, we'll just do some quick introductions, and then Shivani's going to talk about the importance of diversity. I'll touch on some of the challenges we see in terms of making diverse appointments at board level and recommend some ways of overcoming them. Shivani will then highlight a little bit about best practice that we see across other sectors. And then finally, I'll give an overview about our Sport England and UK Sport programme to date, highlighting some of the great success stories that we've had so far. So just quickly in terms of introductions, we thought we'd tell you a little bit about Perrott Labour for those not familiar. We are a search firm ranked in the top 3 of search firms in the UK, supporting sport, educational, research, healthcare, philanthropic, non-profit and cultural organisations. All of our clients are in some way mission-driven or public-facing. And our board practice, which I lead, is therefore tasked with finding senior leaders and next generation leaders who are motivated to move into our sectors. So the board roles that we work on often not remunerated, but it's very much about matching motivated people with passions that they care about. Very proud to work for Perrott Labour due to the genuine passion and commitment that all our colleagues have for the impact of diversity in our sectors. And I, within Perrott Labour, lead our board practice, as I mentioned, so work with a range of organisations at board level, including Oxfam, UNICEF, a range of universities, museums and sports organisations, and have been privileged to be part of the ongoing Sport England UK Sport programme alongside colleagues at Perrott Labour, who I should mention at this point, Imogen Sanders, who is known to many of you today, who's very happily just gone on maternity leave at the moment, expecting her first baby, but sends her best to everyone. And I'm also a member of the Perrott Labour EDI team led by Shivani, who I'll hand over to now.
Thanks, Lucy, and hi everyone. Good morning to all of you, and thank you again for inviting us to speak today on something that is really close to our hearts, something that we really passionately believe in terms of diverse leadership, inclusive organizations. So my name is Shivani Smith. I am a consultant within the Global Nonprofit and Social Impact team, also working on the Sport England partnership, but also leading on the EDI work within Perrott Labour. I'm also in and around the charity sector for the last 20 years. I'm a co-chair in a small social justice charity. So the whole point around governance is also personally really close to my heart.
Brilliant. And so I think we're just going to kick off now into the presentation itself, with Shivani starting about just the importance of diversity.
Thanks. So I think it's we're very conscious that we're kind of preaching to the converted here and slightly stating the obvious about why diversity is important. But and as mentioned earlier, this has been such a big conversation taking place over the past year for sure, but obviously predates that. But we know that it's become a really central conversation at leadership level, and also very conscious that there's a panel later in the day picking up on the theme. So apologies for any repetition that might come up. But what we wanted to do was, again, just kind of cover the main themes around what are those internal and external drivers for diversity right now. The code for sport governance is an obvious one, but also more broadly, media scrutiny is another. Internally, it's about pieces around recruitment, staff motivation and expectations, retention. All of these things are not just in the sports sector, but across so many sectors where there are real drivers for making sure that this is being discussed and then action is being taken. But what really matters is not the conversation, and it's not about the initiatives, but it's the engagement with why and what it means and why it's important and the benefits to not just the organization, but to society, because we are all here because of mission-driven organizations of social purpose. So why are we talking about diversity at all when it is such a self-evident value? Because, yeah, of course, it's about fairness and it's about representation. It's about developing better and healthier organizations, modern and inclusive organizations, and it's about social equity. But I think one of the challenges we would want to put up is it's not just about diversity. The kind of focus on diversity is incomplete without the discussion around inclusion and following on from that, intersectionality. So there's a certain phrase that we like to keep in mind when we're talking about our own EDI work, that diversity is a number, inclusion is a behavior, and equity is the outcome. So whether you're thinking about it from an organizational perspective or societal perspective, those are the kind of things that we like to keep us on track and to keep us honest about what we are actually working towards. So we know that diversity and inclusion work in any organization is so much more than the policies, the programs, the headcounts. So in terms of board diversity, yes, building a diverse board is crucial, but it's not just about representation. That's just the first step. It's not just about who's on your board, but it's about what they are doing, what they are achieving, what that diversity means and looks like in practice. Why is it important? So from an organizational point of view, you know, the amount of work that's being done around these initiatives and issues means that we are now at a point that there's a lot of research and evidence to show how diversity and inclusion manifest in how workplaces are healthier, happier, more successful, whichever way an organization is measuring success, whether it's on the bottom line in the private sector, whether it's impact on beneficiaries in the charitable sector, whether it's recruitment or retention. So there's been massive reports now done by McKinsey and Harvard Business School talking about how organizations do better when they have a better diverse organization across all levels. So there's enough research now to demonstrate that equitable employers in whichever sector outpace their competitors by respecting the needs, perspectives, and potential of all their team members. And that includes board, but it absolutely goes right through the organization, from volunteers to participants, everywhere. So as a result, what we see as recruiters all the time is that diverse and inclusive workplaces are more attractive for candidates that we're trying to get, but also people are more likely to stay and more likely to contribute their best because they feel trusted, they feel committed, and they want to stick around. So for diversity champions at any level, it's a much easier job now to make the business case for investing in diversity and inclusion, to have diverse boards, to have diverse teams. It's a simple case to make, but it's definitely not easy. And we really recognize that whatever size of organization you are, it's hard, long, slow work. It takes a lot of planning. It takes action across the organization. It takes effort, time, patience, and courage to be able to, for want of a better phrase, sometimes speak truth to power, to challenge bad practices, to build or rebuild inclusive organizations that genuinely represent and serve society effectively, which is what we're all trying to do. So whether you're talking at board level with the exec, with the staff, volunteers, athletes, diversity and inclusion, unfortunately, means hard, uncomfortable conversations. So as recruiters, we see this all the time. Whoever we're working with, there will inevitably be missteps and misunderstandings. That comes with the territory, but it's all working towards something really positive. We are part of many, many challenging conversations with clients and with candidates around EDI, whether it's talking to clients about what they mean when they ask for a diverse candidate, what they mean when they ask for a diverse list, challenging, calling out bias, and challenging, it's more common than you'd like to believe, the idea that there's a choice between the best candidate and the diverse candidate. It's not a choice, it's complete false dichotomy that we are seeing over and over again. And recently, we've seen, understandably, whether it's board diversity or anywhere else, there's an increased emphasis on ethnic minorities, BAME, and even when you think about the debates around the language, there's still a focus on particular areas of diversity right now, certainly in the last 12 to 18 months. But what we would want to just flag is that that's sometimes coming at the expense of a much broader view of diversity. What we would want to be having conversations with is around a full spectrum. So whether that's LGBTQ, physical or intellectual disabilities, educational, geographic, socioeconomic, lived experience, these are all conversations we're trying to have to make sure that people don't go down a narrow lens and keep the idea of diversity and representation really broad and, ironically, inclusive properly when we have these conversations. So Lucy and I, we're very lucky. We work with mission-driven organizations across sectors, whether that's the UK voluntary sector, sports organizations, international NGOs, and we can see that being well-meaning, which is absolutely universal, only takes you so far. The organization that are making the most progress, and it is progress rather than success. We are all working towards more equitable organizations, and no one can claim to have gotten it right yet. We're all on that journey, and it depends on how many people and how the resource we have and the size of organizations and who's in that leadership team right now. So yes, there are huge conversations to be had around this theme, for whether it's inclusive recruitment, employee support, unconscious bias, and these are debates. Everyone has, it's a very polarizing conversation, even when you think about unconscious bias, what can you do about it? But this takes investment, and we'll definitely return to that later. But and Lucy will be talking about challenges in the sports sector in particular. But it's such a critical piece. And again, I know I'm preaching to the converted, so forgive me, but it's such an obvious and universal area for inclusion to be critical in terms of sports. But what if as an athlete or as a person who wants to participate, you're put off because you don't feel that you can, because you might not feel accepted or supported? And this is whether it's people of all sorts of backgrounds, whether it's prejudice around race, ethnicity, religion, disability, gender, age, all of it. And there's such huge themes where we can see how much work has been done, how much of these conversations are taking place, and how much social impact this has. Because succeeding in sports, we know, gives people with social disadvantage, especially, the confidence to succeed in other areas of life, which then filters through to leadership. So just, I guess, to wrap up on this piece of the presentation, it's not just an internal organizational priority. It's not just about success having a diverse board. It's about what those boards are then doing, about challenging and championing sports bodies in the role that they have to play, about social equities. And we're hearing this from the organizations we talk to all the time. It's not just about the numbers. It's about then what does that mean about participation and access and challenging prejudice and breaking down barriers to get into sports. And this is something that we would really emphasize and echo from all the organizations we work with, that building a diverse board is a first step, and then those people are then able to deal with the challenges in the sports sector. And that's where I'm going to hand over to Lucy.
Thank you so much, Vani. That was really, really interesting. And I guess now I'll talk a little bit about the sports sector and some of the challenges we see about making board recruitment with an emphasis on diversity. And should just be clear that these are challenges in some cases that we see in other walks of life as well, but we will obviously just be talking about the sports sector today. So I guess just to start with, positive message, we were recently involved with the diversity audit across the sector. So thank you for everyone who was involved in participating in that. We can't reveal the exact numbers today, but can confirm that there has been movement in the right direction since the last audit. So that's great to see. But of course, there's still lots to do. So in terms of the barriers as we see them to building truly representative and inclusive boards, I think we can break these down into 5 main areas. So firstly, something that we hear time and again is the stressed importance of having potential board candidates needing to be part of the sport already, or at least have a very strong existing engagement with the sport in question or the sector more generally. Whilst we fully recognise the importance of mission and values alignment, this is something we feel can be found and tested in candidates without having an existing interaction with the sport. And if you need to have that demonstrable existing knowledge or networks, then this does create a vicious cycle, and particularly if the sports community is not that diverse, or if your demographic doesn't speak to certain underrepresented minority groups, the board will then struggle to attract the breadth and diversity of talent that we know is out there. I hope Swim England won't mind my using them as a positive case study here. We're just finalising the appointment of 2 INEDs with them. And we spoke to so many really interesting, talented individuals from a variety of backgrounds. And some of them had only learnt to swim in recent years due to their cultural, religious backgrounds. And therefore, whilst they'd never connected with swimming or even the sports sector, they each in their own way had a really strong alignment to the positive power of swimming and how it relates to community health and well-being. And that is a really powerful thing to have on a board. So I think the question to all of you is therefore, how much does this interest or involvement in the sport, how much is that needed in the pack that you're going out and the conversations that you're having when thinking about your perfect board members? So that's the first point, and it leads very obviously into the second point, which is around always emphasising a skills-based approach to recruitment. So the reason for this is twofold. Firstly, it's linked to the point just mentioned. It opens the potential candidate pool significantly when thinking more about what a person can offer in terms of their direct skills rather than their motivation or understanding of the sector. It's about thinking about people who can more broadly contribute to strategic vision, people from outside the membership. We have heard some stories about people recruiting directors who they think will give them a less challenging time. And I think, if you really put skills first and from those outside the sector, they may just bring that challenge that might be needed and useful. The second reason that it's important to lead with a skills-based approach to recruitment is just because we have seen a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction in the sector following movements such as Black Lives Matter. We have had some very blunt conversations, with boards and people, not just in the sports sector to be clear, but saying, I want a black person or whatever it might be, and just being very not putting the skills first. And we're absolutely confident that, diverse talent is out there, as Shabani outlined. But, it absolutely must be skills first. What can this person bring? What's the longevity of what they're going to bring to the organisation? And then thinking more, holistically about the diversity that they bring as well. And that's just really important for the long-term sustainability of success at board level. And so again, just think about how adverts and appointment details are perhaps reflecting some of this language. The third point to make is just to be encouraging to be open-minded when analysing CVs for interview. So, if you think about the traditional models of leadership, you might be looking for things like brand recognition, leadership experience, previous board experience. Some people have had different career paths, so just take the time to get to know them, and the more that's invested in these processes at the beginning, the better. And that's the same if people haven't necessarily had board experience before. Be open-minded about this. You could be interviewing someone that might say something that jars about their understanding between the executive and the non-executive, for instance. But I think the challenge to yourself at that point is to say, okay, maybe they don't know that now, but do you feel they have the potential to grow into that role? And with the right support, could they quite quickly pick up what their roles and responsibilities are at board level with the right help? And can your organisation be the one to invest time in their development for the good of the diversity of the sector as a whole? The fourth point is just quite a broad one, and happy to go into it more individually with organisations or in the Q&A, but it's about just making sure you take the necessary time and effort and resource into good recruitment practice. We know that this is already taken very seriously and has come on hugely despite it being a very busy time and difficult time. So I won't labour the top points too much, but it really is just really encouraging people, don't rush, invest in not only financially, but, time as well and resource. And it's about thinking about, where are you advertising? How long are you advertising for? What are you saying in your advert? Who's on your panel? Can you engage other stakeholders in your recruitment process through things like youth panels? Can you do a more traditional search with a long list and a short list? How inclusive are your final interview stages, etc. And just on this point, we are here to help. We'll come on briefly to the Sport England programme at the end. But Perrott Labour are always happy to offer advice on any of this. And just the fifth area to think about in terms of the challenges we see, and Shivani highlighted a little bit about this, it's about thinking about your board once appointments have been made, and if you do bring on people from underrepresented minority groups, really investing in those people. Challenge yourself to think about what are you doing to support this individual's developments, and it's about thinking about things like who are the people on the board who are the decision makers, and therefore investing in certain people who could perhaps be the leaders and the decision makers of the future. So really investing in training and progression is hugely important. Representation is one thing and hugely welcomed, but really question yourself, who are the people making the decisions, driving the debate, leading the committees and chairing the boards? How welcoming are you being to new people coming on? And just one thing to slightly reflect on is what we've seen a little bit is just assuming that people will come on from underrepresented groups to immediately take on EDI leads on the board. Whilst people may have this background and be very strong in those areas, we have had some feedback from people about being automatically assumed that they might chair an EDI committee or lead on a diversity action plan just because they come from a certain background. So I guess just being a little bit mindful of that and thinking about the diversity of the whole board as a whole. And so I guess the final point is just to urge you all, as I know that you all are, but not to take your finger off the pulse when it comes to EDI, and particularly when we're going through periods of change and difficulty. It is easy to revert to the known and recognisable and a safe pair of hands, but please do continue to drive all the areas that we know you are already. We're absolutely here to help, and I'll just hand over to Shivani now, who's going to make a couple of reflections on some lessons that we've learned from other sectors.
Thanks, Lucy. I'll keep it brief because conscious of time, and we do want to get to any of your questions as well. But just picking up from Lucy's point about having your finger on the pulse, we just wanted to highlight a few relevant trends and themes that we've noted from other sectors, and to ask the question what it might mean for the sports sector. Not everything is transferable, not everything is relevant always, and also very conscious that it varies widely depending on the size and the resource of the organization. It's really great to have all these themes and initiatives, but it only works if you've got the time, capacity and resource to do it at the scale that some organizations do. But the big theme that we're conscious of is that there's a really global direction of travel around diversity, inclusion and accountability, crucially. So it kind of puts you in the frame of what CSR, or corporate social responsibility, was like 20 years ago, where it used to be writing a check to your favorite charity or to get your employees to go and paint a wall in whichever local charity there is. And now it's become like a central pillar of good business, of accountable business. And I think this is where the whole diversity and inclusion thing is going as well. That is becoming much more of a central theme as opposed to trying to do the right thing. It's just becoming strategically crucial. And it impacts all of us. So including recruiters like us, as we were talking about earlier, it's more and more of a discussion at every level, at every kind of recruitment about what are we doing in terms of inclusive recruitment practices. But in terms, and as recruiters, yes, we focus on non-profit organizations, but we work a lot with candidates coming from the private sector as well. So there are cross-sectoral themes and international themes that we're drawing on here. So take what's relevant and by all means abandon what isn't. But it is, there's some key headlines. One is around accountability. So just as an example, Coca-Cola has said that they will withhold fees from law firms that fail to meet minimum diversity requirements. So this is not just the US, but across the global organization. And at least 30% for each new legal case, at least 30% of each of the billed associate and partners' time must be from diverse lawyers. Now, like I put diverse deliberately in quotes because it not quite sure what they are referring to. And as we discussed earlier, it could mean a huge range of people, but at least half of that must be from Black lawyers. And that's very much coming from a US focus, given everything that's happening in the past year. But I think it's really interesting that they are putting a monetary value now, and there's like a real imperative for their suppliers to be thinking about that. And that's something as recruiters we are also seeing, the kind of questions we get asked all the time when we are pitching for business as well. The other piece is around removing barriers. So one of the specific ones is around educational barriers. Big name businesses and charities in the UK are increasingly looking for talented candidates, regardless of their educational background. We know that there's a massive bias in terms of educational background, both whether you have it or not, but also if you have it, where you went to university, what degree you got. So those are the things which are now being challenged. So big organizations in the corporate sector like Google, Facebook, Apple, IBM, they are reducing the requirements for degree qualification in many of their jobs. Same theme is being picked up in the charity sector, especially in fundraising, where degree level qualification required is being really challenged. And now there's a whole theme about non-graduates welcome. And this links directly into diversity, because students from disadvantaged backgrounds, low-income households, care leavers, mature students, disabled students, students from BAME backgrounds, they are all they have a much lower participation in higher education. So those people are now being their lack of access to certain opportunities is being addressed by taking away those educational barriers. So that's the thing about educational barriers, and linked to that in some ways is salary transparency. So there's another movement in the charity sector in the UK around Show the Salary, which is again trying to address pay gaps, both in terms of gender and in terms of race. And the campaign argues that not having transparency around salaries disadvantages particularly women, but also in groups that are traditionally disadvantaged through a lack of opportunity, a lack of progression, which means that they are getting paid less, which means if you are judged on the basis of your last salary, you're likely to be paid less than a counterpart who has, for all those other reasons, progressed further and is earning more. So that's another theme which is worth thinking about when you're thinking about recruitment, but also then inclusive recruitment, leading straight on from that. We certainly get asked all the time about these themes emerging around blind recruitment, unconscious bias training, what our recruitment practices are like, how do we look after our candidates, how do we make it accessible, whether it's our materials, our adverts, whether it's thinking about special requirements that people may have to participate. And that's even more pronounced at a time when we are all online. Are we really thinking about how people access online platforms? Is it as easy for people as we think it is? On one hand, it is a massive opening up that you can access people in their own time, in their own way, but equally for people who are visually impaired, for people who have hearing disabilities, how does this work for them? Are we thinking it through? But also inclusive recruitment doesn't just stop once you get the person in, whether it's a substantive role or a volunteering role or a board level. It's also about onboarding, inclusive cultures, progression pathways. What are organizations doing along the entire HR field, and what it means for individuals. And then finally, it's about investment in diversity and inclusion initiatives. So there's a move about turning it into roles, and that shows the resource and that shows the investment. So we're seeing a trend of senior level appointments as well. So Chief Diversity Officer is a job title which wasn't around a few years ago, but now all the big organizations are investing in this. And for example, in the UK, hiring demand for diversity and inclusion related roles surged by 106% last year based on the prior year. So that just gives you a sense of the direction of travel. And that means that the people who are in this field, there's a real war for talent. Because it's a whole new wave of what's called culture first thinking, and that culture is another way of describing diversity, inclusion, how people are feeling when they're working for your organization, whether they want to work for you, how they feel once they're there, what that means at board level, what that means across your organization. And all of that combines, if you're getting it right at board level, to mean genuinely good and impactful governance that has a massive impact on the organization, the sport, and the sector. And that, I think, hopefully segues neatly into the Sport England work that we've been doing. So back to Lucy.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'll just give a brief overview of the programme with Sport England and UK Sport designed to address the lack of diversity at board level in the sector. I know that most of you will be familiar with this work, and indeed there are people here today with members of our network on your boards already, which is just brilliant. However, I think some of you might be less familiar and perhaps not all of you aware of the history of the programme and the successes. So I'll give you a bit of an overview into the history and the purpose of the work and highlight a couple of successful case studies. And so just very quickly like to start with a couple of due thanks as well to Sport England and UK Sport colleagues who have been just invaluable in their initial creation of the concept and consistent commitment to working in partnership with us to deliver the programme. So particular thanks there to Kathy Hughes, Jem Coates, Phil Smith and Chris Grant. So much of the programme's success has been really driven by all their sheer commitment and innovation to the programme. So it started at the beginning of 2019 when we were engaged by Sport England to deliver a programme that was aimed to support the diversity of boards in the sector. We were originally tasked with creating a network of 140 board-ready candidates from different underrepresented minority groups. In October 2019, this was extended to involve UK Sport, bringing the network goal to 160. It was extended again in February 2020 to increase the scope with a real emphasis around candidates from disabled backgrounds, particularly, and was due to be concluded earlier this year, but very pleased to say that it has been extended for another year. The main project deliverables were firstly to build the field of potential candidates, all of whom are from outside of the sector. So, in every way resonate with the benefits of the sector in terms of community building, social mobility, mental and physical health, but haven't they themselves been engaged in the sector in some way in terms of the sort of skills first that I was talking about earlier. We did a skills and diversity matrix, so we tried to create the network very much bearing in mind the particular areas of skills that would be most helpful on sports boards. So alongside building the network, we also hosted a range of events which were designed to support candidates with becoming board ready if they hadn't got that experience already. So some people were very much at the beginning of their non-executive career, or even much earlier in their careers, full stop, and others, were very experienced. And for those earlier in their career, we provided them with training and development. And this was very much alongside a range of partner organisations. So we worked with Birkbeck University, who put together a range of online learning modules. We worked with SRA, who gave a really helpful workshops around the sector and board and what it means to be on the board of a sports organisation. Women on Boards gave great training and development workshops about how you utilise your skills on a board, how you present yourself for interview. And we also had great input from Activity Alignments, Stonewall and Ringing Consulting as well in terms of the identification and mentoring of potential candidates. Once the network was built and we'd given people this training, it's then, and this is ongoing, about sharing potential opportunities with candidates and facilitating introductions and advising funded partner organisations in terms of their own advertising strategies. So this is something that is ongoing and we're always very happy to talk to anyone about this. So just very quickly, we'll go through some of the achievements to date. So there's 194 candidates in the network now. Just some headlines: 65% of those identify as BAME, 16% identify as having a disability, as well as every other minority group represented there. We've had 37 appointments, which is just absolutely brilliant, and it's just so great to really see a tangible outcome in terms of our network going through the training programme and being appointed to boards. So there's a range of successes there, and very happy to go into some more case studies if helpful. But I think the overall outcome and the positivity that we really see and heard is the ability to inspire, engage a whole cohort of people from outside the sector who in some cases admit that they perhaps thought of the sector as elitist and not so welcoming, but who really engage with the really positive power and impact of sport, and in terms of things like enhancing mental and physical health, community engagement, and social mobility. They all recognise they can bring a different perspective at board level and support the sector in thinking about being more diverse and inclusive and engaging in different audiences and what that might look like. And I think another positive has been just slowly combating the myth that the talent isn't out there. There's already 37 amazing appointments and a really inspiring network of other people ready to be placed. So with the support of you all today, it would be great to continue appointing as many of those as possible. And as I said, very, very happy to talk to anyone. We're completely delighted the programme will be continuing from this year, and always happy to chat on that. So I think we'll pause there. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us today. We would very much welcome any additional comments. I know that some have been coming through, so we'll try and pick up as many of those themes as we can.
Fantastic. So I think what we can start doing is pick up on some of those questions. I think those are the points from us. So thanks for listening, I guess.
So I'll try and pick up some of those questions as I go. Just a couple of observations from me, if you don't mind. The first one was a comment that you made, Shivani, about expecting sort of challenging conversations. And for me, that's part of that's half the point of increasing diversity, isn't it? That you're getting in different viewpoints, you're getting in people who are questioning, bringing new perspectives, they're questioning the way perhaps things have always been done. And that's such a useful, that's why better decisions are made. And our institute produced a report a couple of years ago called Conflict and Tension in the Boardroom, whereby a bit of tension is good because you're having those slightly awkward conversations. You're maybe, revisiting assumptions, and what you don't want to do is let it spill over into conflict. But getting that sort of difficult conversation going is really part of the point of improving diversity, isn't it?
No, definitely. And I think we also have that same phrase in the charity that I chair, which is about healthy discomfort, and that you won't get good conversations going without it. I think the other point is, before we get to that bit where people are comfortable about being challenging in those organizations and at board level, that's also a piece of work that needs to be done, so that when you are talking about inclusion at board level, when you've got those people, do they feel that they can raise questions? Do they feel that they can challenge? Are they getting the support from other trustees, from the chair, to make sure that there is space for them to bring different perspectives, as opposed to, yes, I'm here now, but now what?
And something, Lucy, something that you said, something we take notice as well, and that's maybe being a bit understanding of those candidates which don't have previous board experience. And again, almost by definition, if you want to expand the type of person that you have on your board, you have to understand that you're not going to have someone with 20, 30 years of board experience. That's not why you're getting them. You're getting them for the other things that they bring to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there was a question in the chat as well that was about, what more can be done to support people's training and development as well. So I guess just to touch on that, some of the things that we've seen, work well is having a sort of a mentor or a buddy on the board already. And if there's no one obvious from the board, perhaps another board in the sector, someone just to really act as a sound point, can be really powerful and useful. And we listed a range of partner organisations that we've been working with as part of the Sport England programme and the training that we can deliver. So, we'd recommend all of those very highly as well in terms of thinking about the non-executive journey. But, you're completely right. It is about just a challenge back to organisations of really to take a bit of leap of faith and really just invest the time. It might take, people talk about it taking a year or so to really get their feet under the table with these roles. But if you've got more established people on the board, perhaps there is an opportunity to take on people without that experience and really offer them, the chance to learn by doing. I think we may have just lost Craig, but I don't know. Shivani, are there any of the points that you wanted to pick up on?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of comments around diversity of thought, which absolutely just to echo Lucy's point earlier about people coming onto the board with the expectation that they are representing some sort of EDI perspective because of where they're from, as opposed to recognizing that everyone on the board has different things to contribute. And we had a conversation with a client very recently saying that, yes, we have a visibly diverse board, but we all come from the same educational background. So actually what we want you to do is bring us people who have exactly what the comments are talking about diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, to bring that challenge and to bring that healthy discomfort that you were talking about. So certainly that diversity of thought piece is not so that someone who's on the board is then the spokesperson for every other person who either looks like them or has the same disability as them, but it's more about what different ideas are you bringing? How are you able to challenge, and how are you able to build a more exciting consensus, as opposed to everyone thinking the same because they come from a similar corporate background or similar charity background or a similar sporting background. It really is about making sure that you're testing for that. And just to build on that, if that's okay, there's another question which is asked about the traditional application process can often discriminate against people who do not have a corporate business background. Again, this is something that we would say it's about having creative ideas about what your recruitment process looks like. Sometimes we are asking people, depending on the size of the organization, depending on the technology, but sometimes we are asking people to submit video applications. In the charity that I work with, certainly that's something that we offer, that either you submit a written application or if you prefer a video application. So giving people options. There's also times when you can give very specific questions as opposed to asking for a CV. You just say, these are the key questions that we would like you to answer in relation to the cause or in relation to your skills, so that everyone is a bit more on a level playing field and doesn't disadvantage someone who has years of building and creating the perfect CV, but maybe doesn't have the relevant skills. So there are ways of, if you're brave enough to throw out traditional processes, there's definitely ways to get more exciting ways of assessing people.
And I saw a question as well. People were talking about boards being non-remunerated and voluntary, and the limits that has. And certainly it's something we see. And on the very extreme end of that, you can consider perhaps paying at least the chairs or committee chairs, and something to reflect on. But I guess there are other ways of making these opportunities more accessible to people who are perhaps still very much in the thick of their executive career. So I guess one area that perhaps could be reflected on is everything's been happening virtually for the last year, and actually the life has continued. It's all moved on, and we've had feedback from a lot of people that it's meant that they're far more able to partake in being on a board alongside their careers. So I guess just an openness going forward to doing things virtually might make these roles more accessible to people. And you can also think about paying for loss of earnings as well, as kind of a further step on from covering expenses as well. So that I appreciate that it all does have a monetary attachment, but definitely the point stands that the pool is widened, and it is a challenge in terms of the fact that the roles are generally speaking unremunerated.
I think there's another question which came up about where does age discrimination come in, and it's often ignored, and agree that there tends to be a quite narrow focus sometimes about what diversity needs, and age discrimination can come in obviously the two forms about discriminating against younger people or against older people, and we see both, unfortunately. And I think it is one of those things about when we talked about blind recruitment earlier, often that's about names, but when you think about it more deeply, if you take out the pieces around years of experience or educational background, or for example, if someone sees O levels on a CV, they might immediately come up with certain biases and perceptions about what that means and what value someone might bring to a board. So it's really about testing each assumption that we make along the whole recruitment process, each requirement that we put in, So we were talking to one client recently where they were looking for a CEO, and one of their requirements was an MBA. And we challenged, is that really a requirement to be a CEO? And they actually agreed that it wasn't, because they were the CEO and they didn't have an MBA. So I think it's also about being able to challenge and to think about what are the implicit messages as well as the explicit messages. So what we do when we're putting out job adverts is not so much from an age point of view, but we do put each advert through a tool which looks for gender-based language, but also when you think about what other language you're using, which implicitly or explicitly discriminates against. So if you ask for someone with 15 years of experience, you're sending a very strong message that younger trustees need not apply. So I think it's just being really conscious about what messages you're putting out and how it reads, and getting a few people to sense check how it reads across is always a good way to challenge that.
I think time has caught us there, Shivani and Lucy. Thank you so much. I can see from all the comments just how much everybody's has got out of that presentation. It's obviously something that's at the forefront of people's minds, and rightly so. And just to pick up very quickly on a comment that Jackie made about having a network available for people who are new, perhaps to board roles. On the SGA website, there is an online forum. It's called The Huddle, and there's a group in there that's called New to Sports Governance. It's not the most heavily populated group at the moment, but perhaps that is something that that we can build up. So please feel free to go over there, and it will also put you in the sort of same environment as all the supporting material that people experienced and new to boards might use. So I think there's something that we can all do as a sector in terms of helping progress people who want to break into board roles or governance roles more generally. So I think we've all got a part to play in that. The SGA is part of that. The work that Parent Labour and their partners on the project are also doing is also part of that. So Lucy, Shivani, thank you so much. I really do appreciate your presentation. Thanks for your help. And I think we're going to go into a break now. Everybody's earned that. And so please feel free, everybody, to go off, make a brew, stretch your legs, maybe connect with each other, catch up on some of the questions that have been coming in the chat. And if you want to answer each other directly through the messaging on the platform, then I'm sure that will go down really well. But thank you, everybody, for your attention so far. And I will see everybody at, if I check my agenda, 11:30. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Lucy and Shivani. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All the best.
I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes. Craig's going to capture questions. So informally heckle from the sidelines, post questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll take as many of the questions as we can at the end. My goal is to try and stimulate some thinking. I like to go quite fast. These sessions are usually recorded, so to try and maximize the value you might get out, I'll go at speed, and then we can pick up any points that are triggered in your mind as we go through. So I'm going to try and make the links between energy, resilience, decision-making, governance, and what's going on for us and how we might need to change as leaders. So starting with this first slide, if I can move forward. Yeah, so you're all familiar with a curve like this, which is the accelerating pace of change. And I actually think we're living at one of the most exciting moments in human history. This is where we are at this inflection point. So, of course, the world's always changed throughout history, but the speed of the change now is something we've never seen before. It's exponential, and normally if you log an exponential curve, you get a straight line. But if you log the exponential curve we're all living through now, you continue to get an exponential curve, which means the exponential change is itself exponential. That's never happened in human history before. So this is really exceptional times. And there's upsides and downsides to this. Of course, one of the challenges living through these exceptional times is humanity has created a lot of problems for itself. I just want to highlight a few of them. These problems, in academic terms, they're called wicked issues, not wicked in the sense of evil, but wicked in the sense of super complicated and endemic. In fact, I've written a book called Wicked and Wise, How Do You Solve the World's Toughest Problems? Just give you a few examples, as you're all aware. Food safety and security, there are 2 billion people starving on the planet and 2 billion people obese. So there's something wrong with our food system. And particularly around food safety and security, if you add that together with some of our healthcare practices, whether it's big pharma or international coordination, you can start to see the confluence of those two types of agenda as part of what the backdrop is to COVID. And certainly, as we're seeing the very sad images coming out of India, our international healthcare coordination is not great. Some nations are doing really well. Some nations are lagging way behind, not only in their basic provision of oxygen and ventilation, but their vaccination programs and so on. So these are some of the issues that exist in the world. So in addition to food safety, security, healthcare issues, of course, once we come out the back of COVID, climate change will come back to the top of the agenda, because we're halfway through the 6th great species extinction in the history of the planet. And if you look at great news that Biden's rejoined America to the UN, to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, but all the evidence suggests we're not going to keep it to 1.5 degrees. It's currently looking like somewhere between 2.2 and 3 degrees, which will be catastrophic. So, which is why, the UK government has brought forward by 15 years our commitment to a zero net increase in carbon. The question, of course, is that going to be enough, and is it going to be soon enough? So that will come back on the agenda and will affect every organisation, sporting or corporate, in the world, as you see with the sports organisations that are involved in winter sports and snow. If there's no snow, difficult to prosecute your particular sport. So, we could probably talk all day about the impact of climate change in the sporting world. It's one of many wicked problems. Here are the top 12: energy production, our addiction to fossil fuels. Democracy is clearly past its sell-by date. There's been a political regression going on globally in many countries around the world over the last 10 to 15 years, not least because of the corrupting influence of the lobby. So politics is a wicked issue. Capitalism, the obscene levels of inequality, and as a model, capitalism clearly past its sell-by date. Poverty, look around the world, 60% of all Mexicans live in poverty. It's said that most Americans are only 2 paychecks away from ruin, and 12% of America lives in below the poverty line. So we've got real issues with poverty. It seems that if you watch series like Dirty Money on Netflix, that deceit is the new currency of the powerful. So we've lost sight of the truth in this post-truth world and fake news. That's a big problem. And of course, as many of you know, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, LGBTQ, race, disability, discrimination, not only in sport, but in society, massive issue around the world. Criminal justice is a problem. US, for example, has 5% of the global population, 25% of the prison population, tantamount to modern slavery at this point. Big issues there. Immigration, 71 million refugees around the country, 50% of which are under 18. And of course, education, it continues to be a problem. 260 million uneducated people, and half of the planet who do go to education don't reach minimum proficiency. So I say all this not to depress you all, but to say, well, actually, given the accelerating pace of change and the number of complex issues, it's no wonder that many human beings feel like this. So this is to cite Bob Keegan, who is a Harvard educational professor, saying that given all of this going on in the world, many people feel, and his phrase is, in over their heads. That's why mental health and resilience and well-being is a major issue globally, because the world's speeding up and we are beset with a load of complex problems. So where does that leave us as individuals? What does that mean for me personally, my sporting organization? What it really means is we need to change. And that change comes at 3 levels. I'm going to talk about 2 of them. we need to change ourselves as leaders, how we think about the problem. And I'm going to dig into the game-changing nature of energy, emotions, and resilience. So I'm going to dig into a bit about that specifically. That's one of the things we need to absolutely change. Obviously, if we're exhausted by the pandemic, by everything that's going on, if we don't have the basic energy to do what we need to do, we aren't going to succeed in reversing some of the problems we've created. If we're not managing our emotions effectively, we're not going to make good decisions, and we simply won't have the resilience as an individual human being. So I'm going to dig into a bit on that. We've got to, of course, change the way we connect with each other around the world. There's lots of stuff in that. I'm not going to touch on that so much today. And of course, we need to change the way we govern, make decisions, and do business. And I mean business in the broadest sense, whether it's a commercial entity you run or a sporting entity. We've got to change the way we do that. And so I'm going to dig in on these pink things about decision making and governance. So starting at the top, changing ourselves, which is where leadership really begins. Leadership is an inside-out journey. It starts with I, not with what I'm doing. It starts with me personally. So this is the operating model that we work with, whether we're coaching CEOs in big multinationals or potential Olympic gold medalists, is to say, look, what's common to both of you? A CEO wants better results, usually financial results. An athlete wants a medal. So if you're trying to create a better result, most people have realized that to do that, they need to focus on their behavior. So this is leadership behavior in organizations, antisocial behavior in society, or for an athlete, what am I doing? What's my program of activity that will lead me to a gold medal or to the cup or to the final? So most people have clocked that if you don't change what you're doing, you won't change the outcome, you won't change the result. So in order to change the result, we have to change what we're doing, what other people are doing. We've got to change behavior. But many of you will have realized changing behavior is not an easy thing. And one of the reasons it's not easy is whether people do or don't do anything is determined by things we can't see. That's the stuff below the line. What we can see is the behavior and the results we're getting as a result of those behavior, but we can't see what's driving behavior. So in the human system, what's really driving behavior is how people think. So when I'm coaching a professional athlete, if they think I'm an idiot, they're not going to do what I say. Why would they? I'm an idiot. Or if they think what I'm suggesting is nonsense, they won't do it. So I really have to understand what that athlete thinks or what that leader thinks in order to be able to change their behavior. I need to understand what they think about me, what they think about what I'm suggesting. So that's a bit more complicated. If I want to change the result, I have to change their behavior. To change their behavior, I have to change their thinking. I have to therefore uncover what they're thinking simply by asking them. And even if I ask them, they may not tell me the truth. So it's quite complicated. But imagine for a moment you could see, almost like on a computer printout screen next to everybody's head, what they were thinking. It still wouldn't be enough, because what human beings think is determined by something deeper in their system. So, and that basically is how people feel. There is, of course, a reciprocal relationship between thinking and feeling. Feeling affects thinking and thinking affects feeling. There's a loop, it goes backwards and forwards. But as you can see from this diagram, how we feel has a much bigger effect on how we think than the reverse. So that's the dominant player in the interaction between thinking and feeling. Feeling is more dominant than thinking. And any parent will know that if they've sent their child into an exam and they've given that classic parental advice before the child goes into the exam: don't worry. Brilliant. Well, that's really helpful, isn't it? Now, even though that's intellectually correct, and by the way, the child realizes worrying isn't going to help them in the exam, you saying to the child, don't worry, doesn't improve their performance. Why? Because they feel worried, and that feeling will dominate their thinking. And the intellectual answer, don't worry, even though accurate, will not override that feeling of worry. If they're worried, they're worried. And so to change the outcome, you have to change that feeling of worry, And you can't do that with the thought, don't worry. And even if you've got a grip of people's feelings, it's still not enough, because there's something driving how human beings feel, and that's their emotion. So usually when I explain this to people, I make this critical distinction between feeling and emotion. They are not the same thing, but some people get lost at this point. In fact, frankly, some people got lost at the previous distinction. There are many human beings, particularly doctors and scientists, who don't understand the difference between a thought and a feeling. And you can test this, go and ask people how they feel, and they'll often tell you how they think, because they don't understand the distinction. But to change the result, we've got to change behavior. To change behavior, we've got to change thinking. To change thinking, we have to change feeling. To change feeling, we actually have to change emotion. It's still not enough, because down in the basement of all of us, that's driving all of this, is our biology, our physiology. So there are multiple levels, 4 levels you cannot see, that determine whether people do or don't do anything. And if we haven't got a grip of all 4 levels, that's why you see a variance in performance. It's because there's stuff changing in these bottom 4 levels that we're not even aware of. So let me build it up from the bottom. So what's physiology? As many of you know, physiology is just data streams going around the body. So every biological system, whether it's the heart, the lungs, the guts, the liver, the spleen, all generates data. And this data comes in a variety of forms. So it comes as electrical data. So when our heart beats, it creates a spike of electricity. That's an electrical signal. We don't just generate electrical signals. You know, the heart creates a pressure wave. When our gut contracts, it creates a pressure wave called peristalsis. Also, if we listen to your stomach right now, maybe some of you had some toast for breakfast, put our ear to your stomach, we can hear sound waves. So all the bodily systems create lots of different types of signals: electrical signals, electromagnetic signals, chemical signals, pressure waves, sound waves, heat waves, light waves. So if you take all of those biological signals from every single biological system, that's what an emotion is. It's just the energy in motion. So every human being has an emotion every single second of every single day. So even men, you know, that's an emotion. It's just a composite biological signature. So what's a feeling? A feeling is the awareness in our mind of all that energy changing. So if we aren't tuned into that data, then all of that noise and turbulence that's going on in our biology, that's creating our emotions, if we don't feel it, then that turbulence affects our thinking without us realizing. And it affects 2 things in our thinking. It affects what we think and how well we think it. So it affects content and quality of consciousness. So our ability to make a good governance decision is massively impacted by our biology. If the biology is in chaos, then our ability to think clearly, come up with good answers, and deliver those good answers is massively impaired. So our ability to be brilliant every day is hugely rooted in our biology and our emotion. That's why we've got to cultivate an awareness of our biology. And so when we're helping leaders or athletes get better results, we literally drop them down to the basement there in the physiology, and we'll teach people how to get control of their biology and their physiology, and then teach them how to get control of their emotions and tune into their emotions and understand what emotions they're feeling, and give them control of those bottom 3 levels. Once you give them control of those bottom 3 levels, whether it's a leader or an athlete, then you can actually get consistent performance. The problem I've seen in the last 25 years with leaders and athletes is most of them can be brilliant sometimes, but they can't bring their A game every single day. Why not? They're not quite sure how they're delivering their A game. Sometimes they're on fire and they're having a massive effect in the world, and sometimes their performance is frankly dreadful. And for many people, that's a mystery. So that's why in the sporting context, we talk about a loss of form as though it's a complete mystery why these things happen. It's not really a mystery. It's just fluctuations in physiology and biology and emotions and feeling that affect the choice making at the thinking level, and then affect the actions in the world at the behavioral level, which then lead to the results. So it's possible to teach people how to get a grip of the biology and the emotion. So I just want to dig into that a little bit, if I may. Now, the human system is very complicated. There are thousands of signals going around the body. Now, in a complex system, whether it's a business, a sporting organization, or the human body, what we see is some signals are more important than others. In the human system, one of the most important signals is the electrical signal of the heart. So this is 5 heartbeats. So if you watch an ECG and the heartbeats going along the trace, what you can see is the distance between beats is constantly changing. This is something in science that's called heart rate variability. People are beginning to wake up to this. It's called HRV for short, heart rate variability. So your heart rate changes every single beat. Now, athletes for many years have been very obsessed with the average heart rate, but the average is not the critical data. So if we track your biology while I'm talking to you right now, you can see your biology is fluctuating between 60 and 100 beats per minute, and it's bobbling up and down. When we take the average, we might say the average heartbeat is 85 beats per minute. But when we average somebody's heart rate, and of course this is related to physical fitness, which is why athletes are interested in, when you average somebody's heart rate, you basically lose all the variance data. And it's the variance that matters. So if I can give you a metaphor, averaging the heart rate basically makes as much sense as listening to a piece of music and taking an average. So if we listen to Mozart, we'll find the average is da. But if we listen to Pearl Jam, we'll find the average is da. So we can't tell whether that music is Mozart or Pearl Jam because we've lost all the critical data. So the critical data is contained in the variation. Now, heart rate variability is critically important for business leaders and for athletes. And it's critically important for 3 reasons. Number one, it predicts health. So if you want to predict whether your athlete's going to get ill before the championship or before the final, you can measure their heart rate variability. Now, some sporting organizations have started to tune into this and started to track heart rate variability. And some of the algorithms they use are correct and some of them are wildly inaccurate. But the principle of heart rate variability to determine athletic performance, people are beginning to wake up. And also there's about 30,000 scientific papers in the academic literature all about using HRV to predict illness and even death. So in business, that's important for succession planning. But it's also important for, can the athlete make the final, or are they going to get a virus, or are they going to get ill? Now, when you've got an athlete wound fairly close to their optimal performance, often their health is quite fragile. You can use HRV to predict whether they're going to get ill before the major championships. But it also can be used to track deterioration and recovery. That's why HRV is important. So I've been telling organizations that for 25 years. Some of them are only just now beginning to wake up to the importance of that in sport and in business itself. But certainly in business, whilst that's sort of interesting to many, it's less relevant. Okay, so what's the second reason? The second reason HRV is important is because it gives you the ability to quantify energy. And so in an accelerating world that's beset by all these complex problems, as I said at the beginning, you need tons of energy. So as a leader, you need tons and tons of energy. And it's exhausting, particularly many people have experienced through the pandemic. It's incredibly exhausting, and they felt drained of their energy. But how do you get it back? Mysteriously, you're meant to recoup all your energy that night and go again tomorrow, and get it back and go again tomorrow. So energy management becomes unbelievably critical, not only for a leader, but also for an athlete. So when I was working with the GB Olympic squad coming into 2012 and 2016, we were trying to teach them the criticality of energy management. Because many of you know, if you overtrain and you get the training schedule wrong, you haven't got the energy on the day of the performance to deliver your PB. So we have to learn to manage that energy. Now, often we might talk about that in the gym, but one of the things I was trying to explain to many of the athletes is actually it matters more when you're not training. So what are you doing when you've left the gym, when you go home, and how effective is your energy management at that point? So we need to get into that. HRV can quantify how much energy you've actually got. Not how much you think you got, but how much you've actually got. So we can quant that by measuring HRV over 1 or 3 days. So that's the second reason why HRV is really important. But the third reason, which I think in many ways is the most interesting to all of you, is HRV affects your ability to think clearly. Now, the reason you do well in your career is basically down to the quality of your thinking. So if you can problem solve any issue, whether it's to do with a sporting dilemma, a governance dilemma, a wicked issue dilemma, the better the quality of your thinking, the more likely you are to proceed well in your career. If you're on a soccer field, you'll be able to see the pass, you'll see the skiing line, whatever. That is hugely dependent on your quality of your thinking, and HRV affects the quality of your thinking. And the reason it does that, as I'm talking to you right now, your heart is generating this sort of chaotic looking signal and inputting it up the vagus nerve into your brain. Now, when you put an individual human being, either in a corporate environment or a sporting environment, under increasing pressure, the signal becomes more and more chaotic. As the signal becomes more chaotic, what happens is it shuts off your frontal lobes and you have what we call a DIY lobotomy. So human beings will lobotomize themselves under pressure. This is the red mist that comes down that leads to red cards or to outbursts of violence on the pitch. And in the cold light of day, when sanity returns, people make different choices. But under the heat of competition, people often make bad choices, whether they're leaders, leading governance bodies. All human beings are at mercy of a lobotomy under pressure. Particularly difficult is that once you've lobotomized yourself, you don't even realize you've lobotomized yourself half the time. Why? Because your frontal cortex function has disappeared. So you think you're performing quite well. You might think you're making good governance decisions. But how would you know if your perceptual awareness is impaired by your lobotomy? So it becomes a catch-22. Now, the only way of getting out of that trap is to change the quality of that fuel going into your brain, going from two-stroke petrol to rocket fuel. If you put rocket fuel, or what's known in the trade as a coherent signal, the smart thinking comes back in because the frontal lobes turn back on. So the journey to being brilliant every single day starts by controlling the biology and inputting your frontal lobes with a much higher quality signal so it turns the lights back on. So in any meeting, whether you're trying to decide, on some governance issue, if your brain is shut down, it might take you twice as long to get to a decent decision, or you may not get to it at all if your brain's shut down. But if you can control your biology, generate some coherence, not only will you get to a better decision, but you'll get to a better decision quicker. So you'll enable you to go further and faster. And the game changer is managing your energy and your biology and learning to generate some coherence. So that's at the base of the pyramid. That's where the journey starts. And how you do that is with some simple breathing techniques. Now, it's not deep breathing. There are 12 parameters to the breath that you can learn to control, but it's not deep breathing. So when coaches say to athletes, take a few deep breaths, my advice is don't do that. It won't help your brain function. What you really need is a few rhythmic breaths. So it's not deep breathing, it's rhythmic breathing. So when I was teaching the GB rowing squad, it's breathing in a rhythmic fashion. Or many of you, if you've ever been running, getting the breath in rhythm with the pace, the cadence of your muscles is terribly important. So if you've ever been running and you've had a fly hit the back of your throat, which disrupts your breathing pattern, you lose muscular power. You have to slow down as you cough and splutter. So the power goes. So actually rhythmic breathing rather than deep breathing is much more helpful to you. So I'm not going to go into all the details of that. I've written books about it. You can read them. So it starts with stabilizing your biology. But once you've stabilized your biology, most of the game is then at the next level up, which is the emotions and the feelings. So I just want to dig into that a little bit. Now, what we've seen is the biggest myth in performance training for athletes is that some coaches try to get their athletes psyched up before the big game or the big match or the final. And then other coaches will say, no, you've got to be relaxed under pressure. So you get both types of advice. Some are advising essentially to get pumped up, get the adrenaline going, hit their chest before they go on, get themselves psyched up. And others are going, no, you've got to not pump out lots of adrenaline. You've got to be chilled in the face of the threat. So rather than hit the pedal to the metal on the accelerator, you've got to increase the brake fluid. The brake fluid is a different chemical. It's called acetylcholine. So this is the sympathetic nervous system. For those of you with biological knowledge, this is the parasympathetic nervous system at the bottom. And you get both types of advice. Now, neither is true. Your actual performance doesn't depend on how fast your heart is going or how slow your heart is going. What it really depends on is this horizontal axis. Your performance depends on whether you're generating a positive emotion to the left or a negative emotion to the right. Different chemistry is created. So on the positive side, you create a hormone called DHEA, dihydroepiandrosterone, the molecule that makes testosterone in men and estrogen in women. That's an anabolic hormone. You can buy it on the internet. It's a banned substance in the Olympics. Why? Because it's a performance enhancer. But you don't need to buy it on the internet. You can learn to generate much higher levels of DHEA yourself, which I'm going to come on to. So you want high levels of DHEA. What you don't want is high levels of the stress hormone cortisol, because that creates catabolic states. So in every human being, we're balancing cortisol and DHEA. Now, if you feel bad, you will increase your cortisol levels, which will make you feel bad, which will increase your cortisol, which will make you feel bad, which will increase your cortisol, and you will create a vicious cycle, whether you're running a company or an organization or you're a sports person. Now, the opposite is also true. If you're on the left-hand side here and you score a goal and you feel great, you create more DHEA, which makes you feel more positive. You create more DHEA, which makes you feel more positive, and you create a virtuous cycle, which is why some teams will have winning streaks on the left and losing streaks on the right. This is not form, this is biology. So if we can live our life on the left-hand side, we're much more likely to maintain form. Why? Because we're generating positive emotions, we're generating anabolic hormones, DHEA, which increases muscular power, it increases efficiency, and so on. So the knack is to live our life on the left-hand side. That's true in sport, it's just as true in business. So you'll see sales teams that once they made one sale, they'll make 3 sales. You'll see sales teams on the right that once they've lost 1 sale, they'll lose 3 sales. So whether it's sport or business, what actually determines your performance is whether you're on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. So when you heat a system up, you can heat it up into a high energy positive or a high energy negative. So the sorts of emotions up here on the top left, things like passion, enthusiasm, motivation, commitment, determination, exuberance. And on the top right, angry, frustrated, anxious, worried, irritated, aggressive. So what matters really is whether you're top left or top right. Now, many human beings can't make that distinction. So you'll often see sports people erroneous claim that they produce their best golf when they're angry. And the reason people say that is they can't make the difference. They can't figure out the difference between anger and determination. You never play your best golf when you're angry, but you might play your best golf when you're determined, which is over the left. But I think it's anger because I can't distinguish determination from anger. It's just a high energy state. So it's really, really important for leaders to be able to determine whether they're top left or top right. Now, depending on where you are, top left or top right, when you've finished performing, whether it's a business person or a sports person, you've got to recuperate. So you've got to cool your system down. But there are 2 versions of cool down. There's low energy positive or low energy negative. Which one are you doing? So we saw many of these Olympic athletes in 2012 and 2016. They could get passionate, but when they went home from the gym, they would go bottom right and they'd start to vegetate on the couch. So when they heated up the next day, they'd go up to the top right rather than the top left. So vegetation is not recuperation. And you'll see the same thing, people who are running organizations, if we've had a really intense day, is we collapse on the couch and where we should be going is bottom left, into states like contentment, receptivity, curiosity, equanimity, serenity, tranquility, those types of states. And the states to avoid are apathy, inattention, indifference, disengagement, those types of states. So what really determines our ability to perform is get the right energy and get the right emotion going, so we can get the right biology, so we can create virtuous cycles. So we should be living our life between the top left and the bottom left. Unfortunately, many people are living their lives between the top right and the bottom right. And that's the super highway to the diseases that we all suffer, all the modern diseases, pretty much all of them. If you run a high cortisol and low DHEA, you increase your risk of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, senile dementia, and many others, because we're running too high a cortisol and too low a DHEA. The good news is you can train your system to live on the left-hand side, high levels of positive energy, and then recuperating with positive lower energy states in the evening or at the weekend. So we should be vacillating on the left-hand side. Most people are vacillating on the right-hand side. And the worst place to be is the bottom right, because these people in an organization you don't notice because they're not making a noise. The squeaky wheels that you do notice, the people who are complaining about something, are top right. And usually if they're in the top right, they're still somewhat committed, which is why they're upset. So converting people from the top right to the left-hand side is easier than converting people from the bottom right. The bottom right, the people who've given up, they think it's hopeless and helpless, and they've gone to the bottom right. Now, one of the difficulties in helping people to become much more emotionally resilient is they don't have the emotional literacy. They don't know where they are in this universe. So when I ask people to make a list of what emotions do you know, what emotions do you recognize, and I could do that and give you 5 minutes to write down all the emotions you may have noticed in your own system over the last week. I give you 5 minutes to do that. Most people don't get more than a dozen emotions. And of course, the truth is there are 34,000 emotions. Most people don't know more than a dozen. So we are completely and utterly illiterate. We cannot distinguish one emotion from another most of the time. So when you actually ask people on a daily basis, how are you? And they reply, fine, that's a guess. They don't really know whether they're fine or not. So sometimes, just to be a bit mischievous, I'll say, okay, you say you're fine, but are you really fine? Are you fine, or are you not bad? Or are you all right? Or are you okay? Or are you so-so? Do you even know the difference between fine, not bad, okay, all right, and so-so? Do you even know the difference between those states? To which most people reply, what? They can't distinguish. Why not? Emotionally illiterate. So most human beings have got a massive task ahead to be able to distinguish these emotions. So in this universe of emotions, as we call it, there are 17,000 roughly positive emotional states, 17,000 negative emotional states. And if you don't know which planet you're on in the universe of emotions, you're lost. And that's where most people are. They're not quite sure where they are, and therefore it's difficult for them to navigate around the system. So that's one of the big problems. And the second big problem is they actually believe their emotional state is down to somebody outside of themselves, which is why people will say to each other, you upset me, you did it to me. And I keep reminding people, nobody's doing anything to anybody. Because when somebody gets frustrated, and by the way, frustration is the commonest emotion in business by a factor of 4. The emotion of frustration is 4 times more common than any other emotion. So when we feel frustrated, nobody is injecting us with chemicals or forcing us to take tablets that creates the biology of frustration. No. we're doing that ourselves. We are doing this to ourselves. We are creating that chemistry within ourselves. Nobody's doing it to us. Somebody might be behaving badly in front of us, but we're effectively creating the chemistry ourselves. And when we create that negative chemistry, it shuts our brain down. So we are the architects. So that was encapsulated when I was speaking at a conference by one of the conference attendees doing a cartoon, where I said, remember, stop pointing the finger at other people and blaming them for how you feel, because they are not the cause of it, you are. When I was teaching my 4 boys this, I was trying to teach them to stop pointing the finger. I say, remember, when you're pointing the finger at others, 3 fingers are pointing at the real culprit, which is right here. So I taught my sons that. They now point at me with 4 fingers. Say, it's your fault, Dad, you did it. Anyway, that's a joke. What I'm really saying is, if we can accept the simple truth that we are the architect of our own emotions, not other people, then we can change our own emotions. And that is an unbelievable game changer, because it moves us from the victim position. We're a victim of others, our boss, our colleagues, other athletes, the government, the world, the market, somebody else. If we can stop being victims, if we can take back the ownership of our own biology, of our own emotions, of our own feelings, then we've got the possibility of changing them. If we think somebody else is causing all of that, we can't change it, because they're in charge of our emotions, not us. So that's a game-changing switch, and it's particularly game-changing for the ability to make a decision. So I have 2 more slides. If I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, Craig, but I've got 2 more slides I want to just share with you. So the link between this, the biology and your control of your biology and your emotional state and governance is unbelievably critical. So if you look at any leader, if you're running a sporting organization, you're looking forward into your life and you're mainly dealing with the day-to-day challenges. So in business, that's things like revenue, it's products, services, it's scorecards, it's competitive radar, it's operational risks, it's talent management systems. We're driving all of that, which is today's performance, or you're spending some of your time thinking about the vision of the future for your organization, or the ambition for your organization, the purpose of your organization, the strategy of your organization. And I'm going to come to this just as a final thing, the governance of that organization. That's the leadership of the market you're in tomorrow. So most leaders are obsessed by the operational performance today and the future. These agendas, these 2 agendas, are what we call it. What is it that we're doing? And most leaders are it addicted. They're obsessed by it, and it tends to just be the short-term it, which is why governance is critical, because governance is a huge part of building the future. What we pay less attention to is this area that's over our right shoulder, which is stuff like cultural transformation, company values, leadership teams, relationship ecosystems. That's the stuff of people leadership, or what we might call we. And over our left shoulder is other stuff we don't pay attention to, which is some of the things we've been talking about today: energy, resilience, well-being. Often the agenda or the conversation around resilience and well-being is an it thing. What are we doing? Have we got a corporate gym? Are we putting out fruit and apples? So despite all those well-intentioned initiatives, the data gets worse. So we've actually got to dig inside ourselves, not just change the system around us. We've got to control our energy and our emotional state to change this pink stuff. But it's the quality of thinking, it's the maturity and sophistication that we operate with. It's our personal brand. This is our personal performance, or what you might call I. So I've talked a little bit about energy and resilience and well-being. Finally, I just want to say something very quickly about governance, but there is tons of stuff we can improve in our organizations. If you look at when our biology is scrambled, our ability to govern and make effective decisions is significantly impaired. So as a final slide, I just want to say something about the evolution of governance and the evolution of decision making. So if you look at go back to the time when we were a caveman, and cavemen's ability to navigate an increasingly complicated world. Most societies started at anarchy, every man, woman, dog for themselves. very individualistic, and eventually mob rule and tribalism kicks in. Not very sophisticated, doesn't handle much complexity, but at least we've got a few people involved in the decision making. Eventually, most systems get to an autocratic position. So you'll see many sporting organizations, many Premiership football clubs, they have one big, powerful autocrat at the top. Many years ago, this was the default position of many businesses. There's still many businesses run by an autocrat today. So at the governing body, at the exec or leadership team, you've got one person, the king or the queen, making all the calls. And then you've got 9 people who are feeling done to. So it's very good for speed because you've only got one person to consult. So the autocrat will listen to the debate and then overrule everybody or give direction. So you can move fast, but you can't handle much complexity. What happens is that most people will have experienced some sort of co-leadership, particularly if they're parents. This is the family. This is 2 heads are better than one. So you've got mum and dad, or the king and the queen, hence monarchy. It's also the way that oligarchies usually operate, or theocracies operate. Archie Norman, Alan Leighton in a business, it's co-leadership, the CEO, the CFO. Co-leadership, 2 heads are better than one, so it can handle double the complexity, but it creates a court where these 8 people are constantly trying to put a wedge between mum and dad. So it has its own pathology. It can handle double the complexity of an autocrat, but there's still problems with it. And then most modern systems have jumped forward massively. They treble their ability to handle complexity. So we get some kind of democratic process. So the way that many systems are now governed is we'll have a vote. We'll have a vote around the board table, motion carried. That's a 6v4. But the operating principle of democracy is popularity. It's basically a volume play. So if you have enough votes, your decision becomes the de facto decision. Meritocracy, by the way, also operates this way, which is a slight variation based on persuasion rather than popularity. But baked into democracy is 4 people who are permanently rendered offside. So democracy bakes in dissent. So those 4 people spend their entire time trying to steal 2 votes and swing the power back to themselves, which is why many people report, I can't believe the politics in this organization. The politics are driving me nuts. Well, that's because you're operating democratically and you've baked in the dissent, which is why you get flip-flopping in political systems, Labour, Tory, or Republican, Democrat. It flip-flops backwards and forwards, and you've baked in a lot of dissent. Now, as Churchill said, democracy is the best system in the world apart from all the others, suggesting that actually it's not that great. And actually, there is a level beyond democracy. There is actually 3 levels beyond democracy. Sociocracy is an attempt to get to a greater level of alignment, but it usually fails because you get stuck in consensual hell. So then it drops back down to democracy, reinforcing the mistaken belief that the democratic process is the best thing in the world for governance and for decision making, which it is not. It's possible to develop something called holacracy, where you get to 10-0, or something called crowdocracy, where you get to 10,000 v0, which is basically alignment on a massive scale. So if you want to read about that, and actually if we implemented crowdocracy, a lot of the politics that people hate in complex systems would disappear. So this is a way of unlocking the wisdom of the crowd. Now, if you don't know how to unlock the wisdom of the crowd, you will get the mob, you will get mob rule, and you'll get dumbing down, and you'll get averaging, and you'll get poorer quality decision making. So if you understand how to unlock the wisdom of the crowd and operate crowdocratically, you get much higher quality decisions. So the operating principle of crowdocracy is wisdom, not volume. So there are, to offer you a little bit of hope at the end of this, there are ways of governing way beyond the sophistication of democracy, which will give us better quality answers to the wicked problems we're generating. So I've tried to canter through very quickly all of this sophistication. You cannot operate crowdocratically if your biology is all over the place, your emotions are unregulated, and your frontal lobes have disappeared. You haven't got a cat and hell's chance of operating crowdocratically. So you need to get control of your biology and your emotional state, so you can get control of your consciousness. As you get control of your consciousness, one can start to understand, how do we get north of democracy and invent better governance processes that give us much wiser answers to the wicked problems we're facing. So that's probably enough for today, Craig. If you want additional resources, just look me up online. I've written a number of books which you can access off Amazon. And so I'm going to stop sharing for the moment and give you the chance to ask some questions. Cool. Brilliant question, Molly. So one of my 4 boys is profoundly autistic. So I know quite a bit about this. And so one of the things that we taught him, it was in getting control of, the way that your brain works, because as you know, neuroatypical people, or whatever label you want to call it with, autistic brains don't process data in the same way as a neurotypical. And so they often get bent out of shape and get spooked by things. And so we taught him how to control his breathing. That was the start point, is start to breathe rhythmically so your frontal lobes can come back on. So breathe rhythmically, evenly, and through the heart every day. That's the technique. So breathe, we think of it as an acronym. Let me just repeat that. Breathe is an acronym for the technique. B, breathe. R, rhythmically. E, evenly. A, and. T, through. H, the heart. E, every day. Spells breathe. So if you use that technique, it will turn your frontal lobe back on. So we taught him that. So actually the tantrum now will shrink and it will halve in time if he gets his breathing under control. But when he's freaked out, when people are freaked out by what's going on around them, what you'll see is their breathing's all over the place. So if you just remove the disordered breathing and instill rhythmic, even breathing, then the brain will come back on and they'll start to perceive things differently. And then you've got a fighting chance. So these skills and techniques work whether you've got neurotypical and neural atypical. Also to Molly's second part, which is what about people who've got endocrine disorder? We're not helpless in the face of this. What we saw when we did a study with Johnson & Johnson is we were able to increase DHEA levels by 60% inside 3 months, and with no further contact from us, they continued to rise. So DHEA levels were up by 90% at 6 months. So you can alter your DHEA cortisol balance by learning to generate more positive emotions. So even if you've got your background is some kind of hormonal turbulence, you can start to create some stability in that by taking control of your own hormonal imbalance to some extent. I'm not saying it's an absolute, but you can start to flatten out some of the tides that you might be getting and create a greater degree of stability. And it's really by getting over to the left-hand side of the universe. Well, we work with about 90, as you know, Craig, we work with about 90 different organizations around the world, corporate, political, educational, and sporting. So more than happy if anybody wants to reach out to me directly. We're very friendly. We're trying to reduce human suffering across the entire planet. So we work in all market sectors and all geographies. I've got 15 coaches that work for me. In addition to me doing the work, this exceptional team of coaches goes around the world. So if you want to know how to customize all of this to your own organization, then just reach out to me. We're more than happy to chat and explain how this works for your own particular situation. But it's very bespoke. How do you, because every organization is facing slightly different challenges, but we've been doing it for 25 years since I stopped doctoring. We've got a very rich experience. Sometimes it feels like I'm Jurgen Klopp running 25 different Liverpool teams, because we're currently coaching 20 leadership teams in our 90 clients. So it feels like I'm doing Liverpool, Bayern Munich, Real Madrid all at the same time. But we're very open to try and help you. So just reach out to us. More than happy to chat. Well, the biology between somebody in China and the biology and somebody in Mexico, there is no difference. I mean, we've all got a heart. Our heart beats in the same way. We all generate about 100,000 heartbeats a day. And so when we analyze those 100,000 data points for 3 days, so we're basically analyzing 300,000 data points, you would be amazed at how much I could tell about your leadership and how well it's working or not working, your energy levels, the way that you approach things, just by looking at your biology. We've been doing this for 25 years. We've probably got the biggest database in the world on heart rate variability and leaders. It becomes pretty spooky that you can tell what's really going on for a leader. And then we use that data to set a coaching agenda for this particular leader. So we coach individuals, we coach teams, we work on complex systems. It's pretty fascinating. And again, it's spooky how much I can tell about you without asking you any questions, just by looking at your biology. Because how we are as human beings bleeds into our biology. So we've figured out how to reverse engineer that and work from the biology to make some conclusions about how you're leading. And it's uncannily accurate to such an extent is it's very common for me or for leaders that I'm working with to think I've been snooping around them and asking everybody they know about how they are, because I've just looked at their biology. So again, it's pretty fascinating. But the good news in all of that is you can, once you understand how these complex systems work, whether it's a human being or an organization, you can transform them. So the secret is understanding, with forensic precision, how a system works, and then knowing where the sort of acupuncture points are, if you like in an organizational. If you change that bit, all these other things change. Same is true in a human being. If I show you how to change your heart rate variability, it will change your brain function. So it's knowing where to intervene in complex systems. And the good news is you don't have to flood it with a load of complexity. It's coming right in with incredible precision and tweaking something, and it has huge implications. Completely. Right. I mean, right. I mean, frankly, this is something that should be taught in schools. And we've started to teach this in schools. So I'm teaching a lot of people in their sort of 40s and 50s that are running systems, stuff they should have learned when they were 8. And so we've actually now started to go into schools and teach it in schools. And we're seeing improvements in academic performance, reduction in behavioral disruption and exclusion, all those sorts of things. But the good news is the reason you see a variance, just some people are better at dealing with stress or pressure than others. Yeah, that's because they've been trained, right? So some parents inadvertently train their kids better than others. So if I give you a very broad generalization, say something goes wrong, you're an 8-year-old kid and something goes wrong, and your parents' response is, oh my God, it's a disaster, and some big emotional flare, you learn that's the way to respond, right? So another set of parents might be going, don't worry, it's all right, we'll sort that out. So that's what you learn. So we inadvertently get taught by our environment of how to respond when something happens. So it's just training, right? We just train people how to get control and basically move from what you might call reactivity, which is where most human beings operate from, to responsivity. So if you're able to control your response able. So that's what responsible leaders really look like, is they're able to control their response. Most people are reactive, right? They haven't been trained in how to manage their response. So if you want to become responsible, you must manage your response, right? Most people don't do that. They just react to stuff on the news or to each other, right? They're reacting all the time. And you'll see this in immature athletes. And of course, one of the things is say, well, actually, they're a seasoned, the older one in the team, or the, it's sort of calming down the others. It's not about calming down. That's just dropping the heart rate. Calm can be negative. If you're calm and indifferent, terrible. If you're calm and positive. So again, it's understanding how it really works and not taking an oversimplistic. You've got to have some deep knowledge about how these things work to be able to intervene with precision. But the good news is it's just trainable. These things are trainable. So just Google me, you'll see all the books, or Alan at complete-coherence.com. Just look up, the company website, stalk us, email us. I'm on LinkedIn. So just, go into LinkedIn, Dr. Alan Watkins, just send me a message or direct message me somehow. As I say, we're more than happy to help. We're trying to help organizations level up, get more sophisticated and more brilliant at what they do on the inside. So much better levels of emotional well-being and resilience. That's an inner game. That's the I stuff. Much deeper, stronger, more trusting relationships in the we space, in the team and the wider system. So if you fix I, if you level up on the I, you level up on the we, you will level up on the it. You'll be able to do better stuff, better quality decisions, better governance, better vision, ambition, purpose, better systems. Pleasure. My pleasure.